Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm so glad. Welcome to Wrong Talk Radio. Today, I'm hosting Brandis from the Sovereign State Show.
Absolutely. Yes, I am. I'm here. Let's do it.
Yes, sir. We're gonna have an interesting conversation today. So, a couple days ago, Nick Fuentes was on with Tucker Carlson, and that was an interesting interview. It was we went over some pretty poignant stuff relating to the media, relating to the proliferation of pornography around our generation. A lot of stuff that was very interesting. But I think what everyone cares about is the fact that Tucker platformed him in the first place, and there is a kerfuffle going on social media in regards to that. But
100%. Yeah, no, you know, it was to be expected on some level that the this was going to be the kind of response. Because for a while now, people have been noticing that Tucker has been moving. I don't know if you'd say further to the right, but he's definitely been moving further away from Israel, from the kind of mainstream neocon narrative. And he's been talking about it for a while. He did that interview with the nun, where they were talking about the way Christians were being treated in the Holy Land. And he's done many other. He's had on Tony Aguilar. That was the guy who worked for the Gaza Health Foundation, or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and he was talking about all the crimes that Israel was committing in the Gaza Strip, like open firing on people trying to get aid and whatnot. So he's been alienating himself, or kind of creating a rift between himself and the broader Israel aligned conservative movement for a few months now. And so this is kind of the final kind of culmination. This interview with Fuentes is kind of like the breaking point. This is like the official, that's it, line in the sand, America first or neoconservatism, you have to pick a side. So this fallout is expected, and it is a real reckoning. That's what this is. This is a reckoning for the GOP. And there's no way that they can continue with their old line, their old posture, in terms of neoconservatism and foreign policy in the Middle East in 2028. They have to move away. So I think that's what we're seeing here, like a fundamental restructuring and repositioning of the GOP.
I could not agree more. And it does seem like over the last few years, really what's come around has been sort of a renaissance of political theory on the right. For the longest time, I'd say from the Reagan administration in the 80s, really up until 2015 or 2016, the Republican Party was completely dominated by neocons. It was dominated by an establishment, it was dominated by old, baby boomers, a lot of people who were involved in the Bush administration, a lot of people who, wanted to expand geopolitics, a lot of war hawks. And a lot of this was perpetuated for a long time is just that's just what conservative is. You have to support the foreign wars. You have to support, immigration policy that's very pro corporation. You have to support the traditional small government. And a lot of these factors seem to have been really turned on their head, especially when Trump came in. He was sort of a bull in the China shop sort of effect, where he went in, trashed the place, trashed the establishment, trashed the people that were running the show, and he kind of put in with the new MAGA movement. And with this MAGA movement, eventually what's happened is it's morphed, it's grown. And now, especially as younger people, as our generation's getting older, as our generation's becoming more politically active, they are really getting dissatisfied with what MAGA is selling. They see it as sort of a containment. They see it sort of as the moderate option, I guess. And so we're definitely seeing a shift where a lot of the young people, and pretty much anyone under 45 in the GOP, unless you're Brian Hollyhand,
Mm-hmm.
you're primarily focused on social issues, on what's going on in U.S. society, what's going on in global society. Maybe we don't need to go spend 20 years in a sandbox so Dick Cheney can get a private jet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we don't need to destabilize every country on earth for the sake of GDP and oil revenue. And so a lot of these things that Trump really got the ball rolling on, a lot of people are kind of picking up. And so you have this flurry of people coming into their own. And it's also with free speech definitely being a big factor as well. For the longest time, we had the boot on our neck from the state, essentially, where social media companies would shut us down, Twitter would shut us down. I've been banned off Twitter before, back in the day. And
Wow.
so yeah, it's just this whole turnbuckle. And now what we're seeing is, by all accounts, a reckoning where people are able to speak their mind, even if it's really not good things to say. they still can say it and debate it. And that open dialogue is opening the door for so many new people to get into this. There's a million wannabe Nicks on YouTube at this point. They're all posting clips of him and all that malarkey. So there's a million, wannabe Nicks. There's a British Nick now. There's
Mhm.
God, it was there's a Portuguese Nick
Portuguese
Fuentes.
Nick, right, right.
I think there's a Russian Nick as well. I'm not
Really?
100%. I think there is. I don't really know what Russian Nick has to talk about because Russia's always been kind of Russia first. I don't think they've really had any. I don't think they've gone nearly as bad as we have, and I feel like there's a lot more consequences to being against the government in Russia than say, even the U.S. or
So,
Britain.
you're bringing up an interesting point here in that you're talking about the idea that right now where we are seeing the kind of final the final phases, I guess, or maybe not the final phases of I think the final phase of neoconservatism is fair to say, but I think what we're seeing here is this populist fervor that's been brewing under the surface for a long time, and the fact that people have become dissatisfied with, the establishment and whatnot. And I think, let me actually pull this up. I actually think Richard Hanania had a really good, succinct way of putting this.
If
And let,
you send it to me, I can put it up on screen here.
yeah, I'll link it in the Discord. Let me
Perfect. Okay.
see, because this is actually a very interesting take, and I actually generally agree with the thrust of what he was saying here. Let me see. I have it somewhere saved.
No worries here. I'm opening up StreamYards. But yeah, it is an interesting thing, like you said, and this is a global phenomenon. You look at Nepal, they just had a boogaloo. You look at Madagascar, they just stripped their own prime minister of citizenship and kicked him out. They deported their own prime minister. He was born there. He's from there. He's Madagascar, Curry or Madagascar, whatever. I forget the name of the group there that lives in Madagascar, but he was completely booted out of the country and they deported him to France. And so it's a very fascinating thing that we're seeing today
It's
where
anti-globalism. It's anti-globalism. I think if you're I mean just look at the trajectory. We had we had all these British nationalist protests going on in Britain. What was there? Hundreds of thousands of people who were there. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were attending these protests, the ones that were being led by Tommy Robinson. You had the protests that were taking place in the Netherlands. And of course, now with the Prime Minister of Japan, Sanae Takaichi, they call her the Iron Lady. She's considered, I mean, they're talking about her in the media as if she's some kind of far right, ethno nationalist, hates foreigners, xenophobic, the whole nine yards. And, they'll throw all those labels at you. You're xenophobic, you're far right, ethno nationalist, whatever. And in some cases, that's applicable. But in some cases, in many cases, it's actually not the case. And with this Sanae Takaichi woman, the whole entire premise is Japan first. That's it. It's just putting Japan first. Because the liberal democratic establishment in Japan that had been basically overseeing Japanese affairs since the 1970s, 1960s, it has become stagnant. The 45, 50-hour work week in Japan is killing people. The birth rate is going down. Millions of immigrants are coming into Japan to supplement the declining Japanese birth rate. And as a byproduct, you have stagnating wages, work-life balance is terrible, millions of immigrants are coming in, the dating market is horrible, and you have all these, foreigners coming in with this completely different culture. And like, when are we going to get something? When are you going to improve our lives? And fundamentally, it's just sentiment. It's just sentiment. It is a rebellion against neoliberal immigration policy. That's what this is. People want nationalism. People want to feel connected to their nation. That's just what it is. It's a natural human impulse. And we're seeing this take place everywhere, in the EU, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Japan, in America with Trump. We got on the train a little bit earlier than these people, but this is where things are headed. And I think this populist uprising, I think in that tweet that I sent to you, I think it's in the Discord, that
Yep,
that
I just
that tweet from Richard Hanania perfectly sums up where we are in politics today. And we can actually
yep.
go
So
through this. I
here
think
you
this
go.
is interesting.
So here's the tweet I'll let you.
Right. He says Nick Fuentes has 1 million followers. He's done this with no support from the GOP, boosting from MAGA or Musk. Everyone who has become big on the right is now basically Fuentes light. They have to go hard on anti-immigration, start criticizing Israel, etc. By the end of his life, Charlie Kirk had completely adopted their views on immigration and was getting there on Israel. This reminds me of the Trump takeover. It's a movement without elites, without an intellectual culture. So it's all about audience and charisma, plus identitarian concerns. Fuentes has it, Candace has it. The people shrieking about anti Semitism simply don't. You wanted a movement without elites, without people who read, without academics or journalists. You wanted a culture where nobody was ever canceled, where the only sin is lack of baseness or being a cuck, where if the media was opposed to someone, that's all you needed to know and you would defend them. You've gotten it. So, what he's basically saying is this is a kind of cultural revolution. That's what he's implying here. The acceptance of Fuentes into the mainstream, the movement away from, kind of intellectual rigor. Trump kind of introduced that where he started going hard against the media, didn't capitulate to the media anymore. That fundamental restructuring of the environment is what gave way to this kind of populist fervor for it to emerge in in the mainstream consciousness. So I think this tweet perfectly sums that up.
I completely agree, 100%. So it is interesting that we're seeing that effect, and it is truly on a global scale. People are, I guess, we've seen the meme on Twitter till we're blue in the face. The "Got What I Voted For" award, and that's really what we're seeing right now. We are seeing very much a movement of people that are focusing on a very unscrupulous, very unvarnished, very abrasive, form of populism, and a lot of that just comes from being fed up. And you have a lot of people like, Mr. Fuentes, who is a very, very hard right identitarian sort of guy. But the reason he's able to get so much traction is just because people have an appetite for it. People have a desire for change. People have a desire for things to get better. Things that people like you just said are tired of seeing their governments place everything above them except their own citizens. You see, a decades on of a big push from every part of the media and every part of society saying, we need more immigration, we need more cultural assimilation, we need more cultural deconstruction. Every bit of media's, especially with millennial media, was very snarky, very deconstructionist. And so in this, every aspect of society's kind of just been deconstructed to such a extent that people are tired of it, and there is a
Right.
genuine need for
So this
something tangible.
what you're saying is 100% correct. And this is actually what's interesting. So Francis Fukuyama, and people can say what they want about him. Francis Fukuyama is a smart, respected intellectual. I've read his work. He's a smart guy. He published a book in 2018 called Identity. And this was actually in the midst of the Trump revolution, kind of in the early years. And if you remember, I'm sure everybody remembers, in the early years in 2016, Trump was considered radical. Now, Trump is considered a cuck. Or maybe not a cuck, but he's considered like whatever. Like we've kind of more or less accepted him into the zeitgeist. In 2016, the Trump revolution fundamentally comes down to identity. That is what it comes down to. Francis Fukuyama talks about this in his book Identity, and he talks about something called thymos. And thymos is an old Greek term, and it basically just means dignity, right? Humans are broken down into three fundamental levels of behavior, character. You have desire, which is your base, most instinctual, primordial, you know, uh, motivators. Things like eating, sleeping, sex, those sorts of things. Violence, like a self-defense, those are the base. That's called your. Those are like your base behaviors. Then you have thymos. Thymos is in between your psyche and these kinds of base behaviors. So the psyche is about morals, it's about long-term planning, it's about, self-actualization. So you have your base concerns and then you have your kind of intellectual higher order concerns, which is the psyche. In between those two though, you have thymos, and thymos is like the mediator between your psyche and your base concerns. Thymos is about dignity. And this was fundamentally something that was interesting because the reason why this is such an interesting concept is because in pursuit of dignity, in pursuit of recognition, humans would do things that actually sacrificed maybe what was in their immediate needs. They would sacrifice survival. They would sacrifice their lives. And they would sacrifice these kinds of long term intellectual priorities in favor of recognition, in favor of dignity. This is something that they saw all the way back during the Roman Empire with gladiators, during, ancient Greece. This is where the idea of thymos comes from. So today in America, people are moving away from this kind of like, hyper intellectual form of politics that's very liberal, very institutional, and we're moving towards something more fundamental. And like you said, more identitarian, where it's about recognition, it's about workers, it's about bringing back pride to America, it's about overturning this kind of anti-nationalist sentiment that's become so prominent in the past, 10, 15, 20 years or whatnot. It's all about recognition. That's what it's going to come down to. And this is going to be the fight of the next 15, 20 years. Who will define America? Who will define the ethos of our country? What kind of nation will we be? How will we identify ourselves? That's the big cultural revolution I think that we're seeing here.
Absolutely, and that is a big factor that's driving so many of these different factions we see on the right, where one of the core tenets that, really pushes it all together is identity. And so that's why you see so many people start identifying more with, with racial things. You see more people identify with cultural things. You see more people identify with just American as a whole. And a lot of that comes from this deconstruction that we've been seeing, this deconstruction of American identity. A lot of people are saying, well, hold up a second. I'm an American. I know I'm an American. My parents are American. I'm the only country I identify with is American, and you're telling me I'm not American. But you're also telling me that, we're going to take, 20 million people who don't want to adapt and assimilate and really don't want to be American. They want specifically, and this isn't everybody, obviously, but this is a contingent of people that want to just come here to work, and leave, and they're American, more American than you because yada 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 yada. Guilt, white guilt, white guilt, white guilt, white guilt, white guilt. And so what we're seeing nowadays is sort of a rejection of I guess the neoliberal consensus that we've had for a long time, because we reached a point where it's just become so untenable, because that sort of worldview only works when it's everyone's kind of in agreement, but that's just not the case, because you've seen in 2020, you've seen in even before that, a lot of groups, a lot of minority groups have media, a lot of people in politics hijack these movements and use them to essentially create division. And so obviously we're seeing the natural response to it. So that's unfortunately why we see so many, racial supremacists, always so many far, I guess I wouldn't even say far right. I would say more like, I don't even know if I call them right, just wignats and those kind of people, popping their heads out of the
Right.
woodwork because they see it as an opportunity. And so, that is, especially in an American context, why like a civic national identity is so important right now.
Yeah, 100%. Here just to add on to that. Um this is, Patrick Deenan, he talked about this. He talked about the reason why liberalism lost is because it won. Liberalism won, actually. If you take liberalism to its logical conclusion, it is that everybody is an individual. And because the individual is the most valuable, unit of existence, fundamentally, this radical individualist, consciousness, this idea that there's no obligation to the nation, there's no obligation to civilization, there's no obligation to anything beyond myself. I am the highest form of life. The state has no right to trample on me. The state has no right to control my behavior in any form. It's all about this individual uh, indulgence. What happens in this kind of environment, and this is basically what we saw with woke. This was the logical conclusion of liberalism pushed to its extreme. And what happens in a situation like that is when radical individualism becomes the, baseline for most people, is everybody begins to identify with all these subnational identities. And this kind of changed a bit after 9/11, and it kind of awoke in a national consciousness, and like the sales of American flags skyrocketed um in September of 2001 and then in October of 2001. But what happens in a situation like that with radical individualism is people begin to identify more with their subnational identities. So it starts to be, I'm a Jewish lesbian poet from New York City. And that becomes way more intimate and way more salient in your identity and who you are, as opposed to I'm an American. Um, Whatever. I'm an American. I'm Western. I'm white. Like these kinds of bigger, broader, more collective identities that really bring people together. Once that's abandoned, there's a sense of familiarity, which is lost. And that, of course, being compounded with mass amounts of immigrants who are coming to a country where this pre existing attitude exists creates more unfamiliarity and more division and more fragmentation. And the only appropriate response to something like that is the kind of resurfacing of a strong national consciousness, this resurfacing of a strong civic identity. Because otherwise, people are going to prioritize and, you know, feel more connected to these much smaller but less collective or group identities that leads people to kind of being, atomized more or less.
Oh, you're absolutely correct, and that's sort of where we are right now, where we're seeing a lot of these smaller identities that have been pushed. Like just like you mentioned, with through hyper individualism, through disconnection, through a lot of these programs and policies the government had in place, which are in effect breaking any fundamental bonds between people in the country to a point where it is creating a lot of animosity and a lot of tension. And you mentioned too, combining this with massive demographic change in the US compared to 2000, compared to even 2010, this massive demographic change is going to cause an increase in people getting irritated, increase in tension, because you have this combination of factors. You have a combination of these large communities are getting a lot of attention, are getting tacitly encouraged not to assimilate, but to assert their own group identity. And then you have them in large numbers replacing people who've already been there, native populations that have been there for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And you get to a point where the two will not mix. There's going to be tension. It's going to come to a head. And the solution that the left has offered, and really until recently even the right has offered, is shut up and don't talk about it. Shut up and don't mention it. Shut up and don't mention it at all. Shut up and don't. You can't acknowledge it and have the conversation. And because that conversation can't happen and can't happen in a reasonable amount of time, it's going to come to a head, and we're going to see what we have today.
Like I said, I think the only way forward, and I think this is kind of inevitable. I think the only way forward is to kind of emphasize who we are, a way to figure out our identity, because this has been a question for time immemorial. What is an American? Who is an American? This sort of thing. And there's going to be a kind of jockey to define, who's an American, who belongs here, who's not an American. Is Mehdi Hassan an American? Matt Walsh and Mehdi Hassan have been going back and forth on this topic. And is it simply a civic thing? Is it attached to heritage? What is being an American? That's the kind of age old question here. And I guess for me, my proposition is we have to, first off, this is the first thing that needs to be done. And I actually think Nick pointing this out is very important. There needs to be a fundamental recognition, okay? And it doesn't have to be bad. It can actually be very positive, and we can destigmatize it, that it is true that white Christians from Europe came to America and created the foundation for this country. This is just a fundamental truth. Christianity is the moral and legal framework for Western civilization and especially the United States of America. This is just true. This is just factual. That in and of itself is something that must be recognized. It's something that must be recognized, and it's something that must be upheld. Because the moment that moral order starts to decay and the moment it kind of starts to get edged out, Western civilization will die off with it or become something ultimately completely different than what it was. That is something that needs to be emphasized. The Christian identity, the Christian roots of America. That's number one. That's something that has to be identified. And I think that the white core Protestant population that founded America is something that also has to be emphasized 100%. So I would say Black American slaves, the Native Americans who work with the English, and then of course, all these other European settlers who came in. Those are like the core three groups in the early days of America. And I think that there's a place, 100%, for all the different groups that came afterwards, the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, the Czechians, the Slavs, and, Latin American immigrants who came here afterwards and naturalized and became legal American citizens. That I think is a first order. That's like the first priority. Who is American? Who are we? That is a question that needs to be answered because if anybody can just come here from anywhere, not assimilate and be an American, what does being an American mean? It is a defined, it is a strict term, and it's something that needs to be ironed out. That's number one, or else we're going to lose our nation. We're going to lose our national identity. So that's foundational. And for me, this is the other thing I think. I think that there is a way, because a lot of people think that the racial, religious, whatever differences are irreconcilable. I fundamentally disagree. I don't think they're irreconcilable. It is very possible for people to have two different worldviews and to still cooperate and peacefully coexist and come together on more foundational things, on more important things. That's another thing I believe in strongly. So you can have white Christians and then be recognized as the you know, forebears of the United States of America, while that not being necessarily in conflict with all the different groups and immigrant populations that came in afterwards. I think that's the best way forward, honestly.
And I agree completely because when you see a lot of these group identity, that fixes a lot of the problems we see and a lot of the tension we see. Because in the same way that there is a core fundamental white population in the U.S., there also is significant contributions among other groups that have been here for hundreds of years. Case in point, African American community has been in the United States as long as there's been whites in the United States. They have a very unique story through slavery, through desegregation, through the Reconstruction era, and they have a very unique culture, history, and it is something that should equally be promoted and something that should not be, shit on and destroyed, but something that should be supported and embraced as well. In addition, as a core part of America, you have Chinese descendants in the West that built the railroads. You have Hispanics in the South that have predominantly been involved in agriculture, and also with the creation of different communities and towns down there. You have, even among white groups, you have different groups. You have Germans, you have Irish, you have the WASPs in the Northeast. You have all these different groups, and they can still, so needs to be sort of a mutual understanding of reality, and that's essentially what we don't see nowadays, in at least on the left, and even in the right, slowly starting to change. But even in the broad strokes on the right, it's sort of a feeling of, you can't talk about identity, you can't talk about any historical reality. You have to play along to whatever the narrative of America is, I guess, as opposed to the reality of America.
100%. That is absolutely true. And the other thing is this what's curious about this is all of this can be traced back to 1965, but I will just say this first. About 50 it's about I think it was about 49% last time I checked, but I think roughly 45 to 50% of living Americans today can have their ancestry traced back to 1790. 1790, this was when the country was there was only nearly 4 million people living here, about 3.3 million European settlers, about 700,000 black African slaves. So that was what it was. It was about 4 million roughly of those people. Half of the country roughly can trace their ancestry back then. And post 1790, about 50% of this country can trace their ancestry to any series of immigrants that came here after 1790. So there is still a very strong foundational American cohesion. Like that's still a very strong thing. Most of us have ancestry in this country that goes back a long time. And it's just 1965, we have to figure out a way to really change the psychological component that led to this radical kind of rejection of American history. And it's become very stigmatized to acknowledge American history. It's very stigmatized now, and people can only speculate why that is the case, why that why people what's necessary about stigmatizing our history. I think a lot of it comes down to trying to demoralize our country, which I think is very bad for obvious reasons. But we have to regain our pride as a nation 100%. I think we have to regain our pride as a nation, and I think we need to be honest and realistic about our history. That's the way I see it.
And I completely agree, and I think that that is a big part that helps quell a lot of issues and tensions we see today is a realistic understanding of history. There is still the American myth, there is still American identity, there's still a lot to be proud of, and there's still a bit of mythos around the United States that every culture has. But yes, you can acknowledge the historical realities of the U.S., the historical realities of its foundation, of the wars that's been fought, of displacements, of hell, of slavery. There are a lot of things that do need to be reconciled with and acknowledged real reality in a way that doesn't fuck over someone.
Yeah,
And so yeah, go ahead.
100%. And this is interesting to me. What I think there's an interesting rule that they have in China with Mao Zedong. It's the 70-30 rule, and I'm sure most people here are already familiar. Mao Zedong killed tens of millions of people in his attempt to achieve the Great Leap Forward and make China like a real communist country. And then, of course, Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders had to come in afterwards and pick up the pieces and clean up his mess. But a lot of people in China still, despite all the evil things and destruction that he caused, there is a 70-30 consensus which believes 70% of the things he did were good, 30% of the things that he did were bad. And I think for us, for Americans, we cannot be we cannot let ourselves succumb to guilt. We cannot do this whole iconoclasm, moral crusade, because I actually think that's very psychologically destructive and it's toxic for your country and it leads to your country demoralizing. That is a certain way to achieve the destruction of your country and the destruction of your national identity. That absolutely cannot happen under any circumstances. For me, the way I look at it, when you look at the Robert E. Lee statues, when you look at statues of, former Confederate officers, for me, I don't think we should engage in iconoclasm. I also don't necessarily think we should be chauvinistic about them. I believe the best thing to do is take them out of the public square and put them in museums. You don't have to deface them, you don't have to destroy them. You can just recognize history and recognize that we've moved forward. Because at the end of the day, what people need to do is look at the good things as well. 1864 or 1861 to 1865, we fight the Civil War. Up to that point, the United States was a deeply divided country. From 1784 to 1861, slavery was like a hot button issue. Many of the founders, Lincoln, or not Lincoln, Washington in his farewell address was very concerned about the future of America because of that very issue. Many of the early founders did not know or even think that America would survive. So the fact that we're here today, the fact that the South was defeated, and the fact that we still have our country today is one of the greatest feats in our history, in world history, even. And that's something that needs to be recognized. That's something that needs to be emphasized. The reason why all of us are here today is because of these very complex, very great historical feats. Those are things that we need to define ourselves by as well. That's my personal opinion.
Well, I completely agree with you because what you've discussed, goes to a core fundamental tenet of any country, and that is what is the history, what is the heritage? Because we're mentioning, American defining themselves by heritage. Well, what is that heritage? Well, the heritage is they are the inheritors, the descendants of their forebears who built the country, who built different aspects of the country, different facets of the country, and even within smaller groups. Especially ones that have been in the U.S. for a long time, case in point, blacks and whites, their forebears have done a lot of very unique things. And so there can be a recognition of, hey, yeah, the Trail of Tears was bad. Hey, yeah, Polk, or it was either Tyler or Polk. I forget that with Mexican American War, that was, yeah, it was a
Polk.
land grab. Polk, yeah, it was a land grab. But you can also still be proud of that. You can still be proud of, hey, we took a massive, swath of land, and we, if for all intents and purposes, civilized it. We created every city. We created, well, most cities, and I say we, I mean Americans. Settled most of the West, settled the East, and created the environment for the country to be as strong as it is, or at least as strong as it has been. And that is something that worth to be proud of. But you can still recognize the steps that we're taking to get there. And that's the case in every civilization, that there's going to be civilizational, there's going to be bad things that happen in every country, in every group, in every history. There's going to be bad things that happen. And to circle back what you mentioned specifically with the Confederate statues, I don't really have any skin in the game necessarily. I think that when it comes to like stuff related to grave sites or stuff related to like plaques for individual veterans of the CSA, I don't necessarily think those should be removed just because it's representative of the people themselves. But when it comes to like Confederate generals or Confederate monuments, I do agree that it seems to be a bit of a bad taste, but a lot of that also comes down to identity and, I guess Southern nationalism, Southern pride in a lot of ways. So I don't necessarily believe it should be the federal government's or the state government's decision whether or not to remove those. I think it should be up to the local constituencies to decide for themselves what they want to do. And then when they do that, that allows, like you mentioned, you can put them in a museum. You can, figure out what you want to do at that point.
Yeah, it is one of those things I think that's interesting. For me, like I always you and I have talked about this, and I've said my worldview is based on order, harmony, peace. And for me personally, I think like people have to be able to move on from the past. I think that's something that people don't like. Moving on from the past doesn't necessarily mean forgetting who you are, forgetting where you came from, forgetting your roots, forgetting your founding, or even going on moral crusades against it. I think that's unproductive and unhealthy. But more so, moving on from your past is a recognition of what you came from, what led you to where you are today, and then being like, well, we can move forward and create a different, I don't know, set of conditions, if you will. And for me, when I think about moving a Confederate statue into, say, a museum or something like that, not defacing it, not destroying it, not bulldozing it, none of this iconicalism, but putting it inside of a museum, it's kind of emblematic of saying, we came from this, we recognize that there was some good from it, there was some bad from it, but we've moved past this point, and the thing that we want to do now is we want to focus more on unifying the people who are living as opposed to glorifying the people who have passed, glorifying the people who are dead, especially if it creates unnecessary division. That's my personal take in terms of like achieving order. It doesn't necessarily have to be, hey, we're we hate everything that this Confederate soldier, this Confederate general did. We love everything that this guy did. It's more so being able to move forward because at the end of the day, moving forward, making progress, it requires people swallowing difficult pills. That's just the way it is. You have to be able to swallow difficult pills about life if you want to grow, if you want to move forward.
No, I'm on your side very much when it comes to this. Yeah, there is a difference. I still believe in, a sense of pride. Everyone has a right to be proud. And at the same time, but there is a difference between being proud and then also using that pride to cover up, less scrupulous things because you don't like it and because you don't want to acknowledge it. And that's something we see in very common nowadays with everybody. No one likes to acknowledge the fuck ups. Everyone is very pride, and a lot of that comes just because people are tired of getting shat on. So people are very protective over their identity just because they're tired of getting shat on, and we see that a lot here on the right, especially where people are very gung ho about their beliefs, but they don't really want to do any form of self reflection because it's so commonly used as an attack by the left. And so it kind of creates an environment where people are very nervous to discuss those things. But it is interesting though. And speaking of, people not wanting to hear uncomfortable truths, we're talking about the interview a couple nights ago that I had with Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, and people are on Twitter are up in arms over this. You have a lot of people who are very against the show ever happening. And so there's a lot of different reasons why. And so, we'll get into that. There's a tweet here I'll put up on screen here and show. So this is from Seth Dillon from Babylon B, if you're familiar with Seth Dillon. And so he made a tweet saying, the problem isn't platforming, it's promotion. You can share your platform if you're fortunate enough to have one with anyone, but not everyone should be promoted from it. Some people should only be offered a platform for the purpose of exposure and repudiation. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Interesting. The problem isn't platforming, it's promotion. Some people should only be offered a platform for the purpose of exposure and repudiation. Huh. Wh- you know, this is a tough one because people need to understand like there is a deeper psychology to allowing somebody onto your platform and not challenging them. And what that effectively says is like this person it like we are bringing this person into the fore. That's what it basically means, or we are softening this person's image, or we're normalizing or mainstreaming them. And there are I get the argument, um, that you shouldn't platform certain people. I think there's a way to do it though, where it doesn't necessarily have to be like openly hostile or openly trying to repudiate them. Because I think if you do that, it comes off as fragile. It comes off as insecure. And I think when you look back at the Candace Owens interview in retrospect, she does come off as insecure. She comes off as fragile. She comes off as hostile. And I actually think that does a disservice to any kind of genuine intellectual rigor and like wanting to fight. I think if you're going to bring somebody onto your platform and debate them, you can do it. You can do it aggressively. You can even repudiate their beliefs, but it has to be done in good faith. You shouldn't bring somebody onto your platform just to basically openly attack them. I actually think that's a horrible approach to take. And I think in the context of Fuentes and the Tucker Carlson interview, I mean, look, there has to be a reckoning. This is my opinion. This is my personal opinion. There has to be a reckoning with all the baggage that comes from somebody like Fuentes, because there are clips of him, and you can say that they were taken out of context. You can say that, these are whatever, those clips were meant to be ironic. And, you can only use that excuse for so long. I think if you're going to bring somebody like Fuentes onto your platform, you have to be willing to go into his history, go into the baggage, bring up some of those things, be honest and critical about his background and why people are skeptical of him, while also giving him a fair hearing. I think that's the best way to do it, because otherwise, if you don't, it really does just look like ceding ground. That's my personal opinion.
Well, I agree completely. So that is where there is a difference between uh well, I wouldn't say even a difference. That is one of the things that's going to happen if the broader America First movement's ever going to achieve a widespread appeal, mainstream appeal. Yes, there has to be a recognition that, yeah, just being based on the internet is going to create some political baggage. And America is a very large country, and if you want to get any form of widespread appeal, of widespread support, you're going to have to play the political game. And in many ways, that's what Fuentes has been doing recently. When he's been having his appearances on shows, when he's been having his appearances, even his own show, he's been sort of toning down his rhetoric. He's been trying to kind of build a greater appeal, because he's actually trying to play the political game. And a lot of people, in the audience, and a lot of people, in our movement, don't necessarily get that he's trying to just play the game. A lot of people are, really wanting a Howard Stern kind of figure where, like, why aren't you saying more slurs? Why aren't you saying this, that, and the other thing? Well, it's because he's trying to actually have a conversation and create a new consensus. And so I think that with Tucker having him on, it is a very interesting thing to see on Twitter, people's reactions, because for the right, for the long time, and this has been all of us, we've been the victim of of cancel culture. We've been the victim of deplatforming. We've been the ones that have never been allowed on any stream. And you have all these people that have said, that have been called all these words for disagreeing with the status quo. And it's the same people that have, benefited the most from the good graces of the right, from free speech, that are suddenly clutching their pearls and demanding that there is no, that he's toxic, that there can't be any dialogue. And that's just not a proper way forward. You cannot ignore the problem. That's the exact mistake the left made, by just ignoring, and eventually that's going to blow up in your face.
Right.
And what we're seeing is it blowing up in people's faces. So if the yes, I think that Tucker, wasn't necessarily argumentative with Nick, but I think that wasn't his point. I think the whole point of the interview wasn't to necessarily promote Nick Fuentes, nor was it even to debunk Nick Fuentes. It was more to give Nick Fuentes a chance to actually explain who he is, why he believes what he does, and more or less let the audience decide for themselves what they want to take away from Nick Fuentes, but give him a chance to actually clear the air on who he is, because it is a true fact that a lot of coverage of Nick Fuentes is going to be very skewed because of his, bombastic nature, because of the shit he's been quoted as saying. It's very easy to have a preconception of him that isn't necessarily true. And so giving him a chance to actually explain that, I think, was a good thing. And I think it was important that Tucker, having someone like Nick Fuentes on as a controversial figure, gives credence to basically to Tucker, to giving him the credence to the fact that he's willing to have someone like Nick on. And could Tucker have asked him about a couple more things, like the Stalin quote? Yes, he should have very much gone into that a little more. But people also have to remember the history between Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. People are acting like Tucker Carlson is, sucking on Nick's nuts here, but that isn't true. I mean, for the last 6 months or so, Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have been essentially relentlessly attacking Nick. Have been, they called him a Fed, they called him gay, they called him these millions of things. And what we're seeing now is a fact that Nick sat down and said, "Well, here's what I believe. Here's why I believe it. This is what I find is the problems, and these are uncomfortable things he's talking about by all means. But just because the topic is uncomfortable, it should not be verboten, to discuss. Because if your idea is so pregnant, if Nick Fuentes' ideology is so repulsive and so unacceptable, then he can be debated, he can be debunked, and people can walk away with that opinion on their own merit, listening to what he has to say from the lion's mouth. And it doesn't have to be spoon fed to them by some pundit. It doesn't have to be spoon fed to them by some Twitter poster or some YouTuber, like some idiot, like a couple idiots like us. They can get their own opinion of Nick.
Yeah, this is there's I guess two things to this. The first one is this does kind of represent fundamentally the change in the way the media environment looks. Like obviously if Tucker Carlson was still working at Fox News or something like that, they would never let somebody like Fuentes on. They just couldn't do it. It wouldn't work. And this marks this decentralization of the media landscape. It is going to lead to a lot of internal division and internal fracturing simply because there isn't a lot of consensus within, the independent media circles and in the independent media world between Trump, MAGA, light conservatives, those sorts of people. And I don't know. I think like, bringing Fuentes in, I guess for a lot of people, because there's two ways of looking at it. I guess, the more cynical way of looking at it is if you're going to bring Fuentes on, well, then who's going to come next, right? Because Fuentes, for a long time, he was basically considered toxic. He was basically considered radioactive. And he was like a guy that you couldn't go near. You couldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. And it is one of those things where it's like, well, is it going to be, are we going to bring Richard Spencer back? Are we going to bring Jared Taylor back? Are we going to start bringing, and I mean, when you talk about a guy like Richard Spencer, I mean, Richard Spencer is a guy who openly said he supports abortion because it kills more black children than white children. And I'm not necessarily agrees with those things, but at the end of the day, I think it is important to have principles. That's just the way I feel about it. If you're going to be somebody who's a major voice in conservative politics, you should have principles on things that you believe on, the kinds of people that you're willing to talk to, on whether or not. And when you do talk to them, it is kind of your responsibility, at least I would think, to challenge some of their controversial ideas while also giving them a fair shake. That's my personal opinion. But at the same time, this strategy of of endlessly gatekeeping people, that does seem to be a failing strategy. It does seem to be, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I don't know. That's how I feel about it.
Well, it's you're absolutely correct, because it's something I think that is very unique with our generation, and that is that our generation seems to be one that values sincerity. They value That's why podcasts were so popular and prevalent during the
Yep.
2024 election campaign. That's why you see that's why you see so much of this crap during the last election. We basically saw a repudiation of the curated, manicured image of a politician or a pundit. People want real. People want to see what people's actual thoughts are. And so this whole ideological gatekeeping just isn't going to play. It's just not going to work anymore. People want to see, even if it's someone they don't agree with, they still want to hear them out. They want to see, okay, what does this person have to say? I don't want to know what you have to say about him because you already hate him. I want to see what he has to say. Maybe I'll agree with some of it, maybe I'll disagree with a lot of it, but just because Nick says a lot of racy crap, that doesn't necessarily mean that some of his arguments aren't valid. For
100%.
example, when talking with Tucker Carlson, talking about the issues we have with pornography addiction, with technology addiction, with young men getting just fucked in the head by society. A lot of the stuff we're seeing with gender identity, with how that's affecting young people. It very much is something that is causing a lot of attention, and so it's something that very much does need to be addressed.
Here's what I'll say. I think the biggest thing, this is I guess what I've noticed, because what you're saying 100% tracks, this kind of emphasis on sincerity. with Fuentes, here's what's funny about Nick. Nick is somebody who knows how to play the game. He's somebody who knows how to appeal to people. He's very genuine. You know, he says he likes La La Land. He talks about how he's a fat slob and he eats unhealthy food and he goes to sleep late and he likes video games and television. Like, he's a very sincere guy. He doesn't try to do this like whole buttoned up thing, you know, I'm flawless. He says he's a Christian. He says he makes mistakes. He says he does a lot of the other slobbish things that, you know, other people in Gen Z do. And I think that creates a kind of charm, a kind of charisma about him that a lot of other people lack. And I also do think like that lowers people's defenses for sure, and it creates a kind of vulnerability and a kind of connection to a particular figure that I think a lot of people enjoy. But also I think like just generally, he is the he is the spokesperson, if you will. He is the spokesperson for the grievances, but also for the vision that people in our generation want. So I think, like, bottom line, he is kind of the vessel in many ways. And he even said it. He's like an institution now. He is kind of the vessel that is going to be used, at least in my opinion, that will be used to force the GOP to change, fundamentally, radically change their stances on various issues: immigration, economic policy, foreign policy, things of that nature. So, and I think the way he's going about it is it's just very unique and it's a very unique and very interesting way for sure. He represents a kind of change in the culture as well, not just a political commentator.
Oh yeah, well, because what he's doing is very much unseen before. You know, we've had dissident right people, and I don't want to lump him in as the same kind of person, but you know, you had Alex Jones for a long time. You know, you had even in political action, you had Pat Buchanan in the '90s, and a lot of these movements sort of petered out. You had the Ron Paul Revolution in '08, and so you sort of had these movements that have kind of come and gone, but they've all petered out. Nick has been able to be really the first one with some actual staying power, just because he has a very broad appeal. Because his message, believe it or not, you know, some people might find this a bit hard to believe, but it does have a broad appeal. Because, bless you,
Thank you.
um, yeah, because despite a lot of the crap he says, the core message, the core ideology he's pushing is essentially um, everyone needs to deserves to be proud, and he's a white guy, and so he's one of the first, you know, white guys that is publicly saying, you know what, fuck you, fuck your moral grandstanding, fuck your pearl clutching, I'm not going to hate myself, in fact I'm going to be proud of myself. And from that view, you know, a lot of his more vulgar statements have come from, you know, a lot of it's provocative, and a lot of it too is Nick is a very talented orator. He's a
Yep.
very, very apt public speaker and debater. He's good at it. And so a lot of it, I believe, is deliberate because he wants attention. Clicks sell, rage bait sells, you know, engagement sells. And he gets a lot of these people, you know, a lot of young guys who are upset, who are irritated with the way things are going, who are tired of being trashed and tired of being shat on. And they see a clip of Nick Fuentes, you know, saying, you know, your body, my choice, or some offhanded joke like that, and they say, you know, okay, it's kind of funny. I don't agree with it, but it's kind of funny. But they'll give ear to some of his more serious gripes. And some of his more serious gripes, when you get down to the core principle, are things that are fucking over everybody. They're things that are fucking over everybody in America. And it doesn't matter if you're black, white, yellow, red, blue, pink, or turquoise. It doesn't matter what color you are. You are still, we're all in the same system. We're all getting fucked over. And we're all getting screwed over by this political class, by these political boomers, by these political, really just people from a different generation, and whose movement doesn't really exist anymore. And so people can relate to this. People can relate to the anger. People can project their own, you know, grievances on Nick, but he's not someone like Matt Walsh who only serves to take grievances, to bitch about stuff, to, you know, the socialists or the gays or the communists, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and Ben Shapiro cracks a whip and tells him to get back to work. Um, you have someone like Nick who is legitimately able to build off of this. He said it in a lot of his streams that the right wing movement, I wouldn't even really call it conservative movement. The right wing movement needs to have a certain sense of progressivism to it, and that's a very loaded word, because as soon as I say progressivism, we all think left wing, you know, post liberal ideology. But no, there needs to be a form of right wing progression, because the conservative movement, we have not been able to conserve, you know, anything. Every time we've played defense, the left pushes the goalpost, and we run to that new goalpost and say no more. And then they move the goalpost. We run to the new goalpost
It's
and say
about
no more.
creating a new consensus. That's what it's about. It's not about we're
Exactly.
super hardcore traditional, we're super hardcore, I don't know, like 1950s America. Like, no, this is a new consensus. We're building a new consensus, a new national identity, a new political zeitgeist, if you will. That's what I know that's what you're generally referring to by progression.
That's exactly. You said it a
Mhm.
lot better than me. That's exactly what I mean.
Mhm. And it is interesting. I guess just for me, personally speaking, I do generally see him as positive, especially with the things that he's saying now. I guess just my only concern, and this is just a general concern that I have, is that with this kind of new consciousness. And like this was a kind of an out there take, but I worried that with Fuentes, he was going to become moderate in a few years. Okay. He was going to become moderate. Maybe there would be a kind of left wing backlash that in the post, I don't know, in the post Fuentes era after he gets mainstream, and then maybe a more extreme version of, Fuentes on steroids or something like that comes into power and is like, hey, if we're gonna win this thing, we actually gotta like really dismantle the institutions. We gotta like, go balls to the walls, something like, bring back, I don't know, racial discrimination or something like that. And I don't think that's what Nick Fuentes wants. I think he's actually opposed to those things. I just worry that at some point people have to be willing to draw lines in the sand. And that is just my only concern. This has been my consistent point. People have to say, this is our cutoff. This is our limit. We're not willing to support those things. We won't engage those things. We're not even sympathetic to those things. Because what inevitably happens is there's always an inertia to kind of move further, further, further to the right. And it polarizes people even further. So my only thing is, I always just say, people have to have principles. That's it. That's my only thing. I want to see people be principled. This is our stance. We're not changing it, and that's that.
A lot of us who watch Nick Fuentes, especially with white guys who are watching Nick Fuentes, they genuinely do feel wrong. They feel displaced, dispossessed by their own country. They do feel in many ways like they're getting the shaft. And so there is this sort of anger and this sort of I guess the best way to describe it is romanticization of 1950s America, of 1940s America, because it was a point in time where America was 95% white. That was a time in history that they're almost romanticized about. It's why you'll see Italians romanticize the Romans, why Germans can some romanticize the Kaiser, or the German Confederation. British, you'll see a lot of them romanticize the Empire because it was a time in which their country was not just at its peak for its people for demographics, but the 50s was also a time where right after the World War II, America was the undisputed economic superpower. We were right up there with the Soviets as the global superpower. We were the global hegemony, at least for the West, and so it's a time where America, could do no wrong. We were loved globally. We were we defeated the Germans, we defeated the Japanese, we defeated we worked to help defeat the Italians, and so people kind of look back at that time, and a lot of them want to bring it back. But there is a point where ideological dogma has to, meet with
Right.
reality and pragmatism, and that's sort of what one of the big follies of the left is they allowed their ideological dogma to trump reality.
Yep.
And so they went from, hey, we just want gay marriage to you will bake the cake to, drag queen story hour. And so it's sort of they get to a point where, and then now they're at a point where they can ignore any form of reality whatsoever to fit their ideology. And so, yeah, reality has to contradict with dogma. Would it be nice to have a 50s style? Would it be nice to have a 50s style economic policy, 50s style demographics? Sure, yes, it would. But at the same time, that won't happen. America will not go. Unfortunately, anything short of a genocide will not make America go
Yeah.
back to 90% white country, and
Yeah.
that's the only way.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I just like I said, there is a because it's like I said, it's not irreconcilable and it doesn't have to be in conflict. It just has to be managed effectively and it has to be managed intentionally. There has to be a way in which people can have pride in their identity because what effectively happens is that okay, people when they're people are not willing, and this just seems to be something that's generally true. People are not willing to fight for something or identify with something or care for something which they don't believe is theirs. So if people don't feel like America is their country, if people are made to feel like America's not their home, they don't belong here, you're not one of us, what's inevitably going to happen is you're going to cultivate an identity in opposition to America, to antagonize America. I actually think this philosophy of saying this is a white Christian country, if you're not one of us, you're not an American, I actually find that to be a very self-defeating philosophy for that very reason. You're creating enemies where enemies don't need to be created. My belief, it's always been for me, it always comes back to this one word: survival. What will allow America to survive and thus thrive moving forward? That's it. Because there's a way in which we recognize and uphold the white Christian founding of this country in a way that's positive, whilst also simultaneously not marginalizing or diminishing or denigrating the contributions from people who don't fit within that in group. That is absolutely 100% possible. And I feel like that is progressive, and it creates a robust foundational civic identity for Americans where we can all be proud of our country and we don't have to be in conflict, and we can go back to a state of affairs in which we're not arguing over skin color, we're not arguing over, or at least those concerns are perennial, they're not main concerns, primary concerns, or even politically relevant concerns, where we can actually move past and create a new order where everybody is proud to be an American. That's really my hope. That's really my hope. I don't want to hear people say, I'm not an American, I'm a Mexican, I'm not a black American, I'm an African, my people are in Africa. I'm not, it's like that is only going to create entropy and an endless cycle of friction in this country. There has to be a willingness for people to just say, we can all be included in this and we can all hold each other up. That's always been, and that for me, it's not even just ideological, it's pragmatic, because that will ensure the continuity of this country, the survival of this country, and the strength of this country through bonds for several generations. That's my opinion. I think that's the best way forward.
Well, I agree with a lot of facets of that. So, like you just said, and it's something I've said regularly too. Is one of the things I like to say is there is a difference between a fellow American of a different skin color and a foreigner. There is a difference between the two intrinsically. You have people in the country who are American, who have been here for hundreds of years, who've been here for multiple generations, and yes, the majority of those people, just through demographics, are going to be white Christians. And there's also going to be a substantial amount of Black Americans. There's going to be a lot of Asian Americans. There's going to be a lot of Hispanic Americans. And those are people, even people who have immigrated to the country legally in the last, in the last while now, first, second generation, third generation, even some who want to be first generation. If their sole identity is to America and to what America's history, what it stands for, and they see themselves as the inheritors of the American state, as they see themselves as not just another person in America, but as someone who is a part of America itself, that is a net positive. And that you can still have identity with yourself. You can still have support for yourself without basically wanting to shit on everybody else.
Absolutely. I think that is the best way forward. 100%. 100%. Um yeah, I agree. We got any other tweets? Any other?
I think I got another. I got another tweet. So this is kind of a second side tangent here.
Let's
So
do it.
this is something I kind of want to pick your brain on. We haven't really talked about this much, but it goes along with the whole America First thing. What's going on in New York?
With Mom Donnie?
Not just Mamdani, the whole election. So we're seeing a lot of Republicans shilling for Cuomo right now.
Mm.
And, they had the hot girls for Cuomo, the capitalists for Cuomo, or white hot girls for capitalism, whatever the hell it's called.
It
You
was
have a
hot girls
lot.
for Cuomo.
Hot Girls for Cuomo, okay. Yeah, so you have a lot of stuff, and so there's a tweet here I'm gonna put up. I'm gonna see if we can get the audio to work on it, but it's an interview with Cuomo. It's 43 seconds, but it's essentially Cuomo saying it that there's a civil war going on in the Democratic Party. So let's see what he has to say here.
The truth is, there's a quiet civil war going on in the Democratic Party right now. You have an extreme left, radical left. Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani is just the banner carrier for that movement, versus the mainstream moderate Democrats. They now call me moderate. They used to call me liberal. Now I'm a moderate because the whole party shifted. And that's what this election is about. It is that civil war. I believe that far left will destroy the Democratic Party. I believe it will destroy the Democratic Party nationwide if that far left becomes dominant. The truth is, there's a quiet civil war going on in the.
Interesting. Well, you know, you and I have spoken about this a little bit, and I actually do think this is interesting. The fundamental thing here is that the basic way, okay, here's what it comes down to. The way the left perceives the right wing is we are an existential threat to everything that they love and everything that they believe in. That's how they view us. The left views us as being, we want to take away gay rights. We want to take away trans rights. We want to kill trans people or some twisted thing like that. We want to put women back in kitchens. We want to make sure women can't vote. All that kind of stuff. It's always this extremist, alarmist, sensational rhetoric. And what effectively happens when you create a media ecosystem in an environment like that is mainstream moderate Democrats become effectively custodians for the right wing. They don't have the willingness to actually fight against the right wing. They're only willing to hold the line, but they're not actually willing to fight back in an aggressive and strong way against the right that poses a real threat. They say the mainstream moderate Democrats don't have teeth. They're technocratic, they're old, they don't have the vision, they don't have the drive, they don't have the fortitude or the ideology necessary to sustain a long-term counteroffensive against the right wing. That is how people on the left feel about mainstream Democrats, moderate corporate Democrats, and that's how they feel about the right wing. Like, we just want to destroy them. So what effectively happens in that environment is the only people they see as willing and capable of fighting off the right wing are people like Mamdani, are people like Bernie, are people like AOC, the people who are like radical feminist, socialist, communist, those sorts of people. And the reason why is because their ideology is diametrically opposed. It fundamentally cannot coexist with the right wing ideology from their perspective. So that's the reason why there's this quiet civil war going on. And, they feel as if, here's the big one. A lot of these moderate Democrats have been doing this whole thing where they're like, oh yeah, woke is bad. Woke screwed us. Chuck Schumer has talked about it. Hakeem Jeffries has talked about it. They don't want to endorse Mamdani. And the funny thing is they're actually falling on right-wing talking points. Cuomo ran an ad like a few days ago. He actually took it down off of Twitter. He ran a 2-minute ad. It was completely AI generated, talking about Mamdani setting New York City on fire. Very like sensationalist, dystopian ad about Mamdani. And this is the fundamental divide in the left. They're like, we're leftists, we're deconstructionists, we're communists, we're gender abolitionists. The traditional family is oppressive. The traditional family is nothing more than an economic unit for the capitalist class. And there's a smidge of truth to that. But the idea of completely removing that altogether to create a radically free society is fundamentally destructive. And so Cuomo's right about what he's saying, the general thrust about what he's saying, that the radical left will destroy America, which is just obviously true if you have any common sense. But this is the thing. They think the right is going to become more radical. If we don't become more radical, we're dead. That's their philosophy.
Well, I can understand where you come from, and going on with what you're saying about the family unit. Intrinsically, the family unit is not just a bunch of meat sacks for the bourgeoisie, if they like to call it, but it has been sort of co-opted and subverted and used for those means.
Yep.
So it is used very much as a as that, and that's one of the reasons why you see such declining birth rates, you see such declining marriages, because the entire society is essentially twisted to such a way to fuck marriage in the ass. But you're still seeing a large contingent of people with that mindset, because that's unfortunately what they've been shown and what they've seen, because no one's offered a good alternative. Every time we talk about population decline, or everyone talked about demographic issues in the US, the response is always has to do with foreign visas or immigration in some level. What it really needs to be is a conversation about, do we promote families within the country? Do we promote people having kids? How do we do that? What do we need to do to get that to happen? And yes, that can come from some levels of some social programs, but I think that even as a conservative, one of the core things that we can agree on is that we don't like, our taxes being blown on stupid shit. But if our tax money is actually being used to benefit the American people, if our tax money is actually being used to benefit American families, then I think people are more inclined to say, okay, at least we know my money's going to a good place. I don't like it, but I know where it's going. Versus what we have right now, where you have, billions and billions upon billions sent to foreign countries for foreign wars. We have no stake in. Look at we have Europe, we have the Middle East, we have, a lot of wars, we have a lot of economic stagnation. We see our entire industrial sector just completely offshored for the sake of cheap convenience. And one thing that Trump has been trying to do is, with this whole tariff is, twofold. Obviously, one is increase domestic production, and then the other one is to force our other countries we trade with to come to the negotiating table. And I think to some effect that has worked. But when it comes to the economy and how it's downstream from, people having kids, from families, it absolutely is something that is been taken and subverted over the last couple of generations, and it's a very sad thing to see. But that all comes with a morally bankrupt society. That comes with a morally just bereft society, and so it's just something that we have to. That I think that's a part of the America First movement that is very unique among right wing populist movements. Is there is a recognition, because it's a sort of an esoteric belief system in a sense, where it's not just based on tangible policy. We have policy in place, but we also have a societal angle to it, where we view what's happening in America and in the West as a whole and in the world as a whole as something that is not good, as something that is not a good trajectory, as something that is not working out for our generation. So we want to fix it. And that's sort of why we've seen, even in other countries that are rising up, look at Nepal. They were rising up. It was mostly Gen Z, and they were pissed because of housing, of affordability, of job security, and they were tired of seeing the elites rub their nose in their faces. Madagascar was the same way. It was taxes, housing, and jobs. Indonesia had a lot of union-based protests this year too, because of jobs and economic prospects. And so what we're really seeing is almost a Western version of the 2011 Arab Spring, if you're familiar with that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and what's funny about it too, now that you bring up the Arab Spring, the thing is, they wanted to overthrow their governments because they were authoritarian and they were dismissive to the needs and concerns of the average person. Obviously, that's not tenable. Eventually, people will revolt against that kind of condition, given the material conditions and given enough humiliation. And but what's funny about the Arab Spring is that afterwards, after all these dictators were being, threatened and overthrown, you had Ben Ali in Tunisia, you had the former dictator in Egypt, you had Algeria. There was several different countries that were that this happened to during the Arab Spring. They ended up voting in Islamists afterwards. They voted in Islamists. They didn't vote in Western, liberal style, secular, you know, very pro-Western people. That's not what they did. They brought back Islamists just under a slightly different governmental structure.
Well, for Christ's
And
sake, we're seeing that in Syria right now too. They overthrew Bashar al-Assad. The U.S. had a large part to play in that, and now they've replaced him with an Al Qaeda leader who's in. They put him in a suit, and all of a sudden they think he's a Westerner because he's wearing a suit. No, this guy is absolutely a brutal piece of work. And I'm a Catholic, and one thing we've seen is there's been large amounts of religious reprisals against Christians. Very famously, last December, he said, you can, if you're Christian, celebrate Christmas. And then like a week afterward, they saw everyone who celebrated, and then they killed a bunch of them. So
I mean, the thing that people don't understand, and I know people don't like this word, but it is just true. Hit Samuel P. Huntington's fundamental belief about the trajectory in the aftermath of the Cold War era was that he believed the Cold War, the 20th century, was fought over ideology. Liberalism, fascism, communism, liberalism won. And that's the reason why Francis Fukuyama wrote End of History and the Last Man. And he believed that liberal democracy was going to be the final form of human evolution, like the final form of human government. Liberal democracy, that's the way, that's it, it's over. And of course, this thesis ended up falling flat on its face when you looked at what happened with the Middle East and all the failed wars that took place over there, when you look at the rise of people like Trump, so on and so forth, people who are more illiberal in nature. And um, the thing is, he believed that in the 21st century, it was going to be something he referred to as a clash of civilizations. This is what Huntington believed. So in the world, you have 9 civilizations. You have obviously Western civilization, Cynic civilization, which is China, Orthodox civilization, which is Russia, Japanese civilization, Hindu civilization, Latin American civilization, African civilization, Buddhist civilization, and there's one more. I think it's slipping my mind, but those are basically the major 8. And fundamentally, it is important that we define ourselves around our Western values, Christianity being one of them, and maybe other forms of Western democracy, Western liberal values and whatnot. But the thing is, the reason why it's so important to emphasize civilization in these times is because look at what's happening with these revisionist powers. Look at what's happening with China. They're rising. Look at what's happening with Russia. They're challenging our hegemony worldwide. You need to kind of re-emphasize Western values, re-emphasize your civilization. Now is the time when that needs to be done. Look at what's happening with Giorgia Meloni. Look at what's happening with the Japanese prime minister. People understand you need to assert yourself on the world stage, and you need to assert yourself in order to be strong, in order to withstand this kind of attack from the radical left who seeks to destroy that.
I agree. And so we got a couple chats here, mostly shit posting, but we got one chat that I think is actually, I kind of want to respond to this one. There you go. You guys should talk about the White House using Halo for memes. Jesus. Oh, I actually do have something funny to say on that. So I don't, Bernice, I don't know if you were around for this or if you remember Gamergate too well.
I don't know anything about Gamergate.
Essentially, there was a lot of reporting on video games journalism that was very one-sided, and a lot of reporting in video games journalism that was very untrue to how good the games are. There was ethics in video games journalism, and then that kind of snowballed into this larger movement because when people started criticizing it, they were met with a bunch of feedback. They were called, every name in the book. They were called racist, misogynistic. They were called these things because they were calling out games journalists for their underhanded behavior. And so it kind of morphed into this overall thing where it's like, quit putting your bullshit in video games, quit putting your agenda in video games. And people got tired of it. And the left for a long time responded with, every game's political, all art's political, and all this other malarkey. And so, what we kind of saw the other day when DHS put out that Halo tweet was pretty much a response to that, and where a lot of people on the right are kind of saying, hey, yeah, it does suck when politics gets pushed into your favorite video games, doesn't it? And you have a bunch of leftists on Twitter saying, oh my god, you're ruining Halo for me, you're ruining my favorite video games. Like, well, yeah, first time, buddy. It must suck having something you like getting ruined by the government.
That is funny. That is interesting. What was I gonna say? You got to tell me more about this whole Gamergate thing. I'm interested to know because I remember didn't Milo Yiannopoulos get big off of the whole Gamergate situation?
Yeah, so a lot of the guys, I wouldn't call them the dissident right. I guess the best way to describe them is the YouTube dissident right, if that's not an oxymoron. They are essentially were made off of Gamergate. Mr. Medicare, Ethan Ralph, Carl Benjamin, Milo Yiannopoulos. They were all pretty much spawned from Gamergate and from the attention they got from Gamergate, because this was pretty much the first a proto MAGA, I guess would be a way to describe it. Not even politically, because there were a lot of people from various political ideologies involved in Gamergate. It was a very big tent, but it was sort of the first time that we'd seen like a modern tech-based populist movement from the right pushing up against and pushing back against what has been seen by a lot of people as a inherently bad and abusive power, and the sort of elitist, credentialist sort of class, the journalist class, the pundit class, the activist class. And it was the first time they'd really had anyone rise up against the woke machine. And this was way back in 2014. This was before things got nearly as bad as they are now. This was during the heyday, or I guess the beginning of what we'd call woke. It was right in the beginning of it. So a lot of these guys, yeah, they were built off of it. And most of these guys now have moved on to other things. Medicare, he's bless his soul, he's got cancer, so he's not really making much videos anymore. I think the last thing he covered was he did a live stream when Kirk got assassinated. Carl Benjamin, he's actually doing pretty well.
I
He's
know
a very
Sargon.
large, yeah, Sargon. That's Carl Benjamin, yeah.
Interesting. I wanted to touch on this. This is something that I thought was interesting. Sorry, my dog. This is something I thought was interesting. I was watching Ben Shapiro on the Ezra Klein show. This was when was this was about a month ago. And he was talking about this concept of lions and scavengers. And this is something I actually thought was interesting. And I'll tell you how this relates. He said fundamentally, because I want to know your opinion on this. Where will Ben Shapiro be? Will he even fit into the conservative tent? And a
Well,
year or two from now,
shit.
maybe, I don't know.
Where will Ben Shapiro be in a year? Well, if certain people got their way 6 feet underground, but no, obviously that's a joke. No, that's a horrible thing. But
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro, I think, really with the Daily Wire and his whole thing, really irrelevant because he sort of shot himself in the foot. And I can almost pinpoint one tweet he made that really started the downhill. At least for me, this was the moment I stopped taking him seriously. Was when he made a tweet saying, "My loyalty to America is contingent on their loyalty to Israel. And if America stopped supporting Israel, I would not be a proud American." And the way he worded that, regardless of how you feel about Israel, regardless of how you feel about any of that, that's a separate argument. But his response was essentially, "My loyalty to America is contingent on America's loyalty to another country." And that is, for me, something that
That's like a hard red line. That's like a bright red line.
well, that breaks it right down because it's like, well, are you American or are you not? I don't care. I don't care if you're Jewish. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what your ethnicity is. I don't even care if you're, pro-Israel. That's fine. You have a right to support your, the home state of your people. That's fine. But to be an American, born in America, and an American commentator talking about American politics, and to say that was sort of a turning point. It kind of seemed from there, especially after October 7th, he went really far into this, and people kind of started to notice, hey, this guy's a little bit of a shill. This guy's a little bit of a disingenuous shill. He's not being completely forthcoming. And I think a lot of things, and we kind of talked about this earlier, or you did, is that the gas the gas pedal has been held down by a brick as far as right
Yep.
wing populism. Really,
Right,
since
100%.
since 2020, we had a setback in 2020, but then after that, it's been really right wing populism. And so it really, the movement just left him in the dust because he was originally, when he was popular, this was the time where, you couldn't talk about anything. You couldn't talk about any of the issues. There was this very blasé, bland, meritocracy sort of, facts don't care about your feelings, anti-SJW nonsense. So, we saw in 2016, 2017, and, 2018. And then Ben stayed in that area where he was, kind of, he could not identify himself with the American populist right. He could not ingratiate himself because he just could not stop. He couldn't get with the times. He couldn't advance his beliefs. And so he's really just gotten left in the dust. And so in many ways, Ben Shapiro now is very irrelevant because yes, he's very good at calling out the issues. He's very good at calling out what's going on. But just like the rest of the right-wing movement at the time, he has no way of, or means or drive to actually fix it. In fact, I feel like with Daily Wire, with Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro and that whole group, they're not even really upset that there's all this crap happening because they still get a paycheck. It gives them more things to write articles about. It gives them more opportunity to go to college campuses. And it's much easier to, make fun of a 19-year-old leftist college student than it is to sit down and have a legitimate policy discussion with your own side and
Yep.
say, here's what we have to do to fix this country. We are being fucked. We need to find a way to fundamentally fix this country. And so because he just was not able to move on past that, he's just kind of gotten left behind. So we're really being a year, probably still making videos and with an ever dwindling view count. And maybe Matt Walsh will finally quit and go independent. It seems like that's where he's going because, it seems like Ben Shapiro's really just starting to turn on a lot of his commentators. Aw. But yeah, so that's kind of where I am. Where I see Ben Shapiro in a year, screaming into a void,
Yeah,
I guess.
I think that's interesting because in this interview he was talking about something that I actually thought was pretty fascinating. He was talking about this concept of lions and scavengers, and this is kind of the dichotomy that he created. And this was, if people might not have necessarily picked up on it, but he talks about something that's happening in American politics, both on the left and on the right, and it's called the omni cause. And he's talking about this is the reason why you'll have, you know, gender abolitionists, super hardcore left wing feminists who are hanging out with like radical Islamists going to protest together. And it's like, if that radical Islamist had his way, you would be in a concubine. Okay, you would not have any rights. So why are you protesting with this person together? But of course, it's in the context of this Palestinian, pro Palestinian protest. But the general idea here is that this kind of populist fervor is bringing in a lot of baggage. That's the way he describes it. And he says in
Oh,
politics,
yeah.
there's two kinds of people. There's lions and there's scavengers. Lions are the people who want to build, create. They have a vision. They want to unite people. They want to preserve and unite. Those are lions. On the opposite side, you have scavengers. Scavengers are people who seek to destroy, who are opportunists, who are conspiracy theorists. And he talks about this with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alex Jones. He says they are in this scavengers camp. And he puts Tucker Carlson in that scavenger camp as well. So he sees himself as a lion. He sees
Yeah,
himself as a lion. He sees himself as a visionary, somebody who wants to create, unify, push things forward. And I just think it almost is like a lack of self-awareness. And what's
I
funny
wouldn't
about
say a lack. So I wouldn't say a lack of self-awareness. I'd almost say it's a bit of denial.
denial.
The way I see Ben Shapiro, what he reminds me a lot, he's a has-been celebrity because there was a time where he very much was the line. And I think a lot of us, especially as young guys growing up in moderate right wing, a lot of young guys' first introduction to this sort of populist movement, anti-woke, anti-SJW movement, was watching those compilation videos on YouTube back in like
Yeah,
2017
I
with,
remember the good
with
old
Ben
days.
yeah, with Ben Shapiro, dunking on the epic feminist wreck compilation number 57.
Owen
And
Schroyer.
yeah, Destroyer. And so there was a time where he really was the embodiment of, I guess, what we call, based now. He was the guy who was pushing boundaries, who was going after the sacred cows. But the problem is he reached a point where it came into contradiction with his sacred cows or what he believes. And so he sort of just fell into this area of denial. He's just, he's blocked, he'll block anybody if they don't agree with him too much. They will, uh,
That's
he'll try,
bad. That's a
he'll
bad
try to
look.
well, because I will give him credit. He hasn't done it to nearly the extent that a lot of other people have. And I wouldn't even say it's my main critique. My main critique is, he will, work to censor people, he'll work to deplatform people. I mean, I'll see if I can pull it up here. You might have it on
Did
yours.
he
Yeah,
actually?
here. The screenshots, the Charlie Kirk screenshots,
Let me
the
see.
text and stuff. Because that's something that wasn't necessarily Shapiro, but he was very much involved with TPOSA analyzed groups. And so he kind of became someone that was holding down other people on the right. He kind of pulled the ladder up behind him. And so the only people he would accept in were people who kind of agreed with him. So it really created this self denial where he doesn't realize that he's been left in the dust because he won't go stick his neck out and associate with these people. He won't debate them. He won't discuss with them because they're so fundamentally at odds with his worldview and his identity that he can't bring himself to do it. And so he's going to be left in the dust.
Yeah, I just fear. Well, it's just interesting. It's so funny to me. I don't even know what the future of, what 2028 is going to look like. I really have no idea. I don't know how anybody can allow this to continue. I genuinely don't. Like I said, if the cost of living gets worse, if the country gets more destabilized, if the conflict between the right and the left is not resolved, and then in 2028, you get slop again, you get JD Vance or Gavin Newsom or some BS like that. I don't know. I don't know I don't know how this pans out because everybody on the left is already dissatisfied with their leadership. Nobody on the left like Biden. And everybody on the right is
Yeah.
dissatisfied with their leadership. So when
Well,
will
that's
there
how we got
be
Mamdani. That was
Yeah,
what Mamdani was. Mamdani very much was a repudiation of, Cuomo, I guess, of like these left-wing, neutered, sort of,
deballed.
yeah, just these, these very neutered politicians. And so what we're seeing is absolutely a response that's where Mamdani's, a lot of his popularity is coming from. And so, while we're talking about this, I'll just put this little image up because this is something just tweeted out today. And I was like, these guys, whoever's running the social media account for a DHS is, God damn it.
Going hard.
There might be a Shia Pippin. It's like, oh cripe, like, oh cripes, Nick Fuentes likes to joke about, trying to infiltrate the right with the, his movements. Like crap. I mean, you see the crap that gets posted on here. It's kind of funny.
Yeah. I see. I don't understand the reference though. What's the reference?
I believe it's Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, one of the two. Some of in the chat might be more literate than I am. It's like I'm pretty sure it's a Hobbit reference or something. But what always gets me about DHS, and I think this is something that you might agree with, and a reason why a lot of us have just kind of gotten a little bit fed up with, with Trump, with the right wing, is the mainstream right wing, is that it's all bluster and no substance. They'll post these edits, they'll post shit like this, they'll post provocative stuff that pisses everybody off, that gets the crowd riled up, that, gets the leftist fifis in a bunch, but we won't get any tangible results, in the sense that we will not receive the numbers that we were promised. Essentially, Trump ran on this whole, we're going to deport them all, we're going to kick them all out, we're gonna get rid of all 10 million of them, and at this point, we've had less people to date than Obama's deported. And so and the way he's going about it is in a very like
Aggressive.
aggressive, antagonistic way.
And yep.
He's broadcasting it. And now I say the DHS as a whole. Trump isn't personally, sitting there with a game controller or a phone call. It's the people working for him. But they're going out and they're doing these in a very public way, in a very the way that isn't even advantageous. And it's kind of similar with why we see the guard deployments, where Chicago makes some sense, but you see like in Portland, Oregon, you have the National Guard deployed out here. Why? Well, it's not really because there's some great insurrection, regardless of what he's saying. He's doing it because he knows that these people want to riot, that they want an excuse to riot, and he wants an excuse to bring the hammer down. So he's sort of calling their bluff. He's waiting. He's positioning himself so that this tension is going to build up, and all it takes is one idiot doing something stupid, and there we go. We're going to see a massive crackdown.
It's funny because I actually think it is one of those things that I think that needs to be done. And people will say it's illiberal. People will say it's fascistic. I think that's a little bit sensationalist, to say the least. But I think there is a context in which it is necessary. I mean, and I think Nick put it in. I think he put it succinctly. He says the conditions that we're in currently are unprecedented, and people don't even understand how crazy and ridiculous it is. But it is just that. It is insane. It is ridiculous. We're in a situation in which there is some 25, 30 million illegal immigrants in the United States, okay? Many of them are criminals. Many of them did not come with families. Many of them are sending money, remittances back to their countries of origin. Many of them are not even paying income tax or federal tax because they're getting paid under the table in cash. So we have 25 to 30 million illegal immigrants in this country using public services, using public transportation, healthcare, the law enforcement, putting their kids through K through 12, all that kind of stuff. And these people are not citizens. They're here illegally, no legal standing to be here. 25 to 30 million. 25 to 30 million, unprecedented. Imagine this. I'm El Salvadoran. Imagine if I went to Japan and there was a flood of El Salvadoran illegal immigrants to Japan. And I, as an immigrant, this is what we're seeing now. I, as an immigrant to Japan, participated in protests against the Japanese government to deport these people. That's like a form of a soft civil war, soft insurrection. That's crazy. It's like I'm an immigrant to Japan, and I'm El Salvadoran, but you have all these illegal immigrants from El Salvador going to Japan, and I just got to Japan. My goal as an immigrant should be, let's blend in, let's get low key, let's assimilate, let's, respect the culture and civilization, don't violate the laws. Then I go out there and start protesting. That's what we're seeing here with a lot of Latino immigrants who are protesting against ICE. They got here yesterday and they're protesting against the American government to try to enforce immigration law. So you have illegal immigrants who are on the verge of being deported, and then you have the children of immigrants who got here yesterday protesting against ICE to keep them from deporting illegal immigrants. It's the craziest thing ever. It's the
Well, yeah,
situation
it
we're in.
is. Well, it is a situation we're in, and that's why you see it is a very it's a shit situation, and like I completely agree with you. You have such a massive,
It's
unprecedented.
demoralizing. It's demoralizing.
It is, and that is one thing I wish the administration would do is, and I think they have done to some degree, where you just have to ignore these people that are screaming and rioting and protesting because they're not citizens, they're not representative of what is needed to be done. Because Trump ran on a platform of deportation, he ran on a platform of mass deportation, and he won the election running on that platform. In fact, he won every single swing state on that platform. And because of that, there is, it's not the great mandate that he likes to brag about, but there is an implied mandate and an implied understanding that this is what he's going to do. And in a lot of ways, the way he's going about it is pretty stupid. But at the same time, you do have to factor in the response that we're getting, these violent response we're getting from the left and we're getting from these people. And they're basically demanding the right to illegally be in a country and demanding the right to, and again, this isn't everyone. This is just the people we're seeing demanding a right to stay and saying, fuck your borders, fuck your sovereignty, fuck your country. And saying,
Right.
we're here
It's like
because
sovereignty doesn't
this
mean
is
anything to these people. It's crazy. That's a
well, it's contempt.
fundamental right to a country, sovereignty. If you don't have
Yeah.
sovereignty, you're not a country.
It's a view with contempt. They don't view the U.S. as a legitimate state, and they view, for whatever reason, depending on where they are, that they have a claim to that territory. They have a claim to the country, and because they have the mindset and the view is not from a position of we want to stay in this country. It is this is actually mine, so I'm going to fight you for it. It is essentially that is not just a protest. You can't debate that. You can't vote that away. That is something that is going
It's
to.
psychological,
It's psychological, and so it is this whole demoralization.
ideological.
Oh, it's ideological and psychological because I mean, you look at every aspect of media and everything. It's a massive bit of demoralization that's happening in all respects right now, and until that is tackled, things are not going to improve drastically.
Yeah, I don't understand. What bothers me with Trump, and this is something that many people in his previous administrations have pointed out, what bothers me with Trump is his incompetence. And, people can say what they want about Trump. I'm sure charismatic leader, funny guy, I'm sure he's intelligent, but this is the same thing that happened in his first administration. In his first administration, Mark Esper, his Secretary of Defense, was talking about how Trump wanted to bomb Mexico. He wanted to bomb cartel manufacturing labs in Mexico, and his own Secretary of Defense had to explain to him why that's a stupid idea, bombing an ally in a scenario in which you can kill innocent civilians. Just as ridiculous on its face. Furthermore, John Bolton talked about his incompetence on basically every geopolitical conflict. Every geopolitical conflict, he didn't know anything. He didn't know the first thing. John Bolton talked about his incompetence. And, everybody and people have written multiple books about his corruption. Omarosa talked about it. Kathy Hutchinson talked about it, or Katie Hutchinson talked about it. There's been dozens of books written by various people, hundreds of pages, talking about Trump's being incompetent, talking about Trump being corrupt. There was this whole rug pull with the Trump coin and the Melania coin that took place earlier this year. His net worth went up $3 billion. Everything. Just Trump is not a he's not the kind of he's not a leader that I would think I would look up to. But at the very least, you actually have to follow through on the one issue, just the one issue, the one. If you can't do the tariffs right, if you can't end the wars, if you can't, successfully fight the left, the one thing you have to be competent on, the one thing you have to do is the deportation thing. That is your bread and butter issue. That is your golden ticket. And it's just the same thing, the incompetence, the sluggishness. And we've seen this over and over. We saw this with the National Security Council. We saw this when Mike Waltz got fired from National Security Advisor for having unauthorized contact with the Prime Minister of Israel. during meetings with the National Security Council. We saw the we saw the signal chat leaks with JD Vance and Pete Hegseth and all these other people who were talking about sensitive information in a private messaging app with a journalist who saw all of it. We have, it's just the same things. It's this kind of incompetence, failure to end the wars, and we don't need to relitigate the whole thing, but it's like the one thing, just the one thing that we needed you to do, you couldn't even do that successfully. That's the frustration. Where is the competence? Where is the leadership? Where is the iron?
And then I will say I don't necessarily trust John Bolton as the most, neutral,
True.
representative. I don't really believe much of the shit Bolton says, but when it comes to
He's a
Trump,
smart guy. I'll give him that.
he's a smart guy, but when it comes to Trump, the administration, he has a lot of reasons not to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to the administration, what we see right now is I think a part of it is what you want to do versus what you're actually able to do. Because, no man rules alone. Trump came in office. He had all these ideas, especially in the first administration. He had a lot of these ideas. He had a lot of beliefs, and he had a lot of it he takes away from his work in the corporate world and his work in media. And he had an assumption that he would be able to just finesse his way and get what he wants because he's been able to do it so effectively in the past, and he hadn't held any public office prior to this. And so a lot of it is coming from, okay, there's only so much you can do, especially the first time around where the whole system was working and pushing against him the whole time. But now in 2025, after the election, that excuse is gone. He had 8 years now, almost 10 years now of Trump, building his message, carving out his message, working on his problems, working on his policies, finding people he could trust. And what we're getting in response to that is a lot of shortcomings. I am a fan of a lot of the tariff policies just because I do think it is a necessary
Same.
short-term pain to revitalize American industrialism, to revitalize American jobs. Yes, it's going to create a short-term situation where foreign investment's going to dry up, foreign companies are going to start fucking off, but that's going to create an open environment where the free market will plug it with domestic product. And I think in a lot of ways too, it's helping out as renegotiating trade deals with countries like Japan, and it's worked out very well because we've had the Japanese Prime Minister come down and give them a bunch of cherry trees in D.C. And so he has done a lot of good stuff. And I think with the deportations, one thing he did do very well was stop border crossings.
That's
That was
true.
something he was able to do successfully. However, again, the way he's going about it is not systematic. It's not systemic. He's not applying the pressure. He's not saying, we're not going to play these games. We're not going to listen to your bullshit, court appeals. We're just going to, it was a joke. Like, you can just do things. And that is what's needed because unfortunately what is necessary is not what's going to be politically expedient. And that's what I think the right wing the right wing mainstream is starting to realize is that they cannot placate us. They can't placate America first. They can't placate younger people because we're living through it. We're in such a level of shit. No one can afford a home. No one can afford rent. No one can afford food. No one, you
A
have young women.
family,
No one
healthcare,
can afford to have kids. You
a
have young women.
car.
A car. You have young women who are having to work 3 jobs to provide for themselves when that shouldn't be possible. And I know I've said before my opinion on traditionalism in the nuclear family is I believe women should have the right to work, but I think they should not have to work in the sense that there should be an environment where you can have a single family household, where you can have a environment where you are able to provide for your family, and you can still do this through the free market. You can do this through right-wing politics. You can do this through a right-wing lens. You can fix the massive amounts of corruption in every level of government. You can redirect this money into helping people. You can redirect them into a social program that isn't just some leftist bleeding heart, emotionally bankrupt, suicidally empathetic, give free money to everybody,
Yep.
gives for all, but you can do it in an institutional way where you have a social system based on employment, based on your work ethic, based
Yep.
on meant to
Right.
help people.
I agree. This is the
So
thing. This is the thing that bothers me. We're stuck in a situation where it's basically a shit sandwich no matter how you slice it. Because the problem with the left is like you get the left in, you get another corporate Democrat, they're just going to do the same thing. They're going to let millions of illegals come across the border. They're scared to do deportations. Like they have to capitulate to the media because the media is left wing. That's how they get all their support. The right wing is not pigeonholed in the same way. But then, of course, with the right wing, what do they do? More corporate tax cuts, more wars for Israel, more Zionism, JD Vance and Palantir. It's like it's a shit sandwich no matter how you slice it. The question is, who is going to move to the America First position? That's the fundamental question. And maybe, I don't know, maybe a third party is necessary. I don't think that's viable right now. I don't think anybody serious
Third
thinks that.
parties will never in America's election system, third parties won't work. Musk tried it and imploded in 2 days. If the quickest way to nuke our movement is to create a third party because that lets us get easily swept out of the GOP.
Okay,
What America First needs to do, and what we've been doing, is sort of what MAGA did in 2016, and that
force.
is
We have
come the
to
GOP mainstream,
hold them, right? We have to
capture the party.
yeah, right, capture the party. I mean, that's that right there is the thing. It's just there's so much the big problem here, and this is what I've always come back to. It's the system fundamentally. How do you get the moneyed interest out of politics? That's the big question to all this. And people say if you do a progressive tax rate, if you tax the billionaires or whatever, they're all going to leave. They're going to take their businesses elsewhere. And it's like every other country is going to do the same thing. So I don't know what you're talking about. This country has the biggest, by far, consumer base in any country in the world. They're not just going to leave because you force an employer to pay 5% of whatever their employee makes, match that. That's not going to happen. I think that's preposterous. The question though
I
is,
do get the argument. So I do get the argument where I do get where you come from. I will say, yes, there is a certain argument to be made that yes, if you make it inhospitable for companies to do business, then yes, they're going to go overseas. I would say that a way to kind of mitigate this would be domestic production, domestic, I guess, billionaires, where there is a incentive to hire American labor and an incentive to provide for that American labor, and maybe not necessarily through just the normal, tax the rich shit, but more through a sense where taxing the tax policy should be in a way that it's not laid on the hands of the working class, they're not laid on the hands of the people to be reliant for this. And because billionaires, they do pay taxes, they try to get, they're smart, they figure out every way they can
right.
to avoid paying taxes. So there is a way that yes, you will create an environment where you can cause these issues, because yes, there will be a lot of countries, especially like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, a lot of China, a lot of tech driven countries that already have institutions in place for their citizens that will welcome these people, and it will be a disadvantage to the US. So there is a way that you can still keep
I'm
the free
I
market.
I think but there are some sectors that do need to be nationalized, in my opinion. Infrastructure, railroads, oil, energy. Like there needs to be companies that are owned by America, owned by the federal government, that get subsidized to meet working needs, to meet the needs of workers, to meet production needs, those kinds of things. I don't think all of those should just be handed over to the private sector so that they can, I don't know, do whatever they can to undercut wages and increase their bottom line or increase their profit margins. I think we have to figure out a way to reset. That's my thing. And not all private sector businesses or whatever, but the important ones, I think we need to enforce that kind of policy. The other
Well,
thing it
sorry, go ahead.
well, I was going to say the other thing is um uh it was about the Republican Party generally speaking. It is the moneyed interest. That is the big question. That right there is the big one. How do we deal with the situation with big interests in politics? How do we deal with Wall Street? How do we deal with Silicon Valley? How do we deal with the, I don't know, APAC, NRA, Chamber of Commerce, whatever? How do we deal with all these moneyed interests? Because those are the people who are really sucking the wind out of the power of the average American voter. That's what we need to figure out. How do we curb their influence? How do we prevent them from sabotaging our country in a way that will only lead us to certain destruction? That's the question I want to know.
And
It's a tough one.
that is I mean, shit. That is the question. I mean, to kind of circle back what you were saying with the nationalizing, there is, I believe, the way, if you want to get people to make some money off this, what you do is you allow for collective profits from nationalization, for the sense of, like, so look at the Emirates. The Emirates has large oil wells. Well, Emiratis receive a cut of the oil revenue every month. They receive a check in the mail as part of the profits from this nationalized oil system. And I do agree that there are areas that can be nationalized. Transportation industry, building roads, yes, that needs to be nationalized. I think that it can be subcontracted, but I think it needs government oversight in the sense to prevent or to create a framework where it won't be abused. I do believe there should be a limited free market of competitors and companies and contractors competing for contracts, for rail contracts, for road contracts, for airport contracts with infrastructure or to build bridges. Because the government doing it on itself will be overly bureaucratic, overly expensive, and it won't get done nearly as well as it could be. But there can be a framework in place that can allow it to be done both economically feasibly and also mutually beneficial to the American people. And I think what it really circles down to is one key thing, and that is good faith. We need a clearinghouse of just the levels of corruption and nepotism in the government that
That's
is so.
yep. Corruption is the key word.
The system only works when it's being used in good faith. And for a
Right.
long time, the American system was at least surface level used in good faith. That's not the case anymore. We're at a point where they're not even trying to hide it. There's so many fingers in the pot taking and taking and taking, and nothing's being added on. Well, the pot's almost empty, and we're the generation that's paying the fucking bill. We're the generation that's getting the shaft. We have you have the boomers that had the best quality of living, best quality of life, best quality of economic prospects, and they were able to have a good run for a long time. Then they gave birth to the millennials, and you had the millennials who had a very long run, who had a childhood to envy, and who because of that had this very ideologically optimistic view of the world. That's kind of where Obama's coalition came from. That's where the whole, with Dreamers, you had the whole media landscape. And so that's kind of where we created the socially just bankrupt society we see now. But so every generation prior has had some level of opportunity, and not to mention that they didn't have their issues. Obviously, the millennials had the '08 recession when they were coming of age to start working. The boomers had the oil crisis in the Gulf. They had the Cold War, and so it's not to say there aren't challenges, but there was at least a system in place and a way to improve things within the confines of the American system. And we're at a point now where the system's been abused and it's been, fucked or raked over the coals so damn much that without a massive I don't want to sound like Klaus Schwab, without a great reset of the government, in the sense of how it's operating and what's modus operandi is to be for the people, nothing's going to improve.
I mean, that 100% puts that. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I mean, for me personally, I think just instinctually, everybody kind of knows that there is something deeply wrong with private equity being able to, or private equity or a hedge fund being able to buy like an apartment. And I'm not saying the scale is something that's, huge here, but it is a prevalent thing. It is a thing that happens. A hedge fund or a private equity firm being able to buy up a condo in Massachusetts and make, I don't know, $10 million in revenue that year. And then through creating, a fake LLC, call it Brookfield Management LLC, Brookfield Consulting LLC, what they can do is they can take that $10 million in revenue that they made, and then they can offset that to these two fake LLCs that are attached to the same parent company, but they can register these LLCs in states that have no state income tax. And then they can end up paying way less on that $10 million in taxes, even though they bought that building in Massachusetts because they claimed the profits in two different states. Things like that. This is the fundamental problem. This kind of corruption, this kind of like just gaming the system, this kind of rent-seeking behavior, it is inherently corrosive. It's just like obvious. And the other one is like, why is it? This is another big problem here is there's no incentive to build. That's the problem with financialization. One of the main issues with Wall Street and financialization is 85% of the money generated in the stock markets is off of derivatives. It's off of bonds. It's off of stocks. It's off of speculation. That's where all of the money is coming from. 85%. Only 15% of the revenue or all the money that's generated through Wall Street goes into something productive, like a startup. And that's where most of it goes. It goes into a startup company in Silicon Valley because it's profitable. So the problem is if you have $5 million, $10 million, $50 million, what is going to get you more bang for your buck? Trying to compete with like the super corporation with that $50 million and effectively get whooped because there's the markets are so saturated, or to take that $50 million, put it into a hedge fund or put it into something else and watch them double your money. It's a perverse incentive, just fundamentally. The whole entire financial system, it's just so bad. Like people making money off of speculation, off of stocks, off of gambling. And Sagar and Jetty talked about this, and he put it way more succinctly than I ever could. But that is kind of the issue we're having here. Why is it that our entire economy is built on speculation on real estate, speculation on whatever asset? It's horrible. It can't sustain itself. It is too fragile. We need to get to a point where we really do nationalize, create real jobs, create real economy, give people real jobs where they can pay for their families. And because I believe in many ways, the stability of society and families comes downstream from the economy. So I don't know. That's just my general perception of the situation we're in right now. We have to move away from this hyper financialized model and to something that's more sustainable. That's why I like what Biden did with the CHIPS Act.
I am listening to you. Sorry, I was just responding to this. So I agree. I do like I say the CHIPS Act was pretty good, especially in regards to domestic production, because even outside of just the economic policies, we look at our manufacturing. The majority of our shit's made in China. It's made by cheap, mass-produced, basically slave labor in China. It's fucked. And so we have a lot of our microchips, processing, computing parts are coming from Taiwan, for example. And if China goes into Taiwan, which I'm sure eventually they're going to try to do.
It's already been war gamed. They think it's going to happen by 2027.
Yeah, I don't want to put a date on it. I just don't know enough about Chinese affairs, but it is a system where we're fucked, because if we have we cannot exercise independent geopolitical maneuvering, because we've essentially, what happened to us is what happened to the British and the French after World War II. We became reliant on our foreign investors. We become reliant on foreign manufacturing. We become reliant on the global market for our existence. And so because of that, because we become so ingrained, when you see someone like Trump come in and try to fix these things, with tariffs, with trade policies, with protectionary measures, Middle East or in Asia, get taken out or get occupied or decide to not like us, or there's a government regime change, or there's a populist revolution, in any way, the risks are astounding to the US. They're astounding. So I also have a comment here I'll read, I guess, to get your opinion on it. So we have here from Evelyn. I hate the economy right now. It's so hard to live when you have health issues, and healthcare is too slow and inexpensive.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. That's the whole problem with it. And I mean, people have been talking about this for a long time, and I'm not going to pretend to be like an expert on public health administration or healthcare or anything like that. But it is one of those things where it's like, that to me is a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed, an overhaul to the healthcare system. But it's just one of those things where, once again, there's so many hands in the pot. There's the insurance companies who want to make money off of it. There's the data brokers who want to make money off of it. There's plenty of other players who want to make money off of the healthcare system. It is very profitable for the people who seek to benefit or seek to make profit or gain from these ridiculously high premiums, from these ridiculously high, um, you know, deductibles and whatnot. It's the same fundamental problem. It's the rent-seeking behavior, and that is one of those things that it's just like, until that gets sorted out, this is going to be on the table. This is going to be a primary issue for people for God knows how long, and it just needs to be resolved. I don't even know really what else to say about that, other than like, that is some form of subsidized healthcare. I think is the best path forward. That's just my personal opinion.
I agree. So the way I see it is, I'm a big proponent of the free market, and I still believe in private healthcare. But the best way I would equate this to is a lawyer. We all have the constitutional right to have legal representation if we're in court. Now, you can be given the government lawyer, which is a public defender, which is capable of doing the job, but maybe not the best, maybe not the fanciest. You're not going to get Cochran, you're going to get Saul Goodman. So, you're going to get a public defender, but you have the option to pay for a better lawyer. You have the option to pay for a more robust legal defense and a more robust counsel. So in the same way, that can be applied to healthcare, where there should be a baseline minimum form of a healthcare
A
provider
package.
where a package where an ambulance ride won't kill you, in debt, where you have access to things that are legitimately required for you to live. And I'm not talking about the liberal shit. I'm not talking about, hormone therapy, or I'm not talking about elective surgery or cosmetic surgery. I'm talking about insulin. I'm talking about, dialysis. I'm talking about necessary medical treatment to live a healthy life. These should be options that we should have. However, we should still have a robust private healthcare sector that competes with that, because this will be mutually beneficial, because you will have the private healthcare providers that will still offer good services and will still be allowed to operate and function very well. But because they're now competing with a baseline government um, institution with baseline government healthcare, there will be an incentive for them to have more favorable rates, more favorable payments, more favorable services, more expedient healthcare, cheaper insulin, cheaper drugs, cheaper access to treatment, because it will be better for their business. So it will create a better climate for the healthcare industry overall. And like you said, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not, I'm not a fellow in healthcare science or healthcare policy by any means. We're a couple laymen,
Yeah.
bitching on the internet. But yeah, there can be a balance, and I think this is one of the things, and that some of the wool that's been pulled over people's eyes is that we view these topics as mutually exclusive. You're either a leftist wanting to make a mandatory DHS and make a mandatory healthcare and all this other crap, or you're on the right and there can be absolutely no social medicine and no social healthcare whatsoever. And honestly, one of the biggest things that will broaden America First's appeal is being able to say, no, these are not mutually exclusive. We can do it, but we can do it right. And part of that factors into what we were talking about earlier with immigration. And this is what's happening in Britain. Britain has a nationalized healthcare system, the DHS. And that DHS ran really well for a long period of time, but right now it's imploding because they have millions and millions of new people who aren't paying into it but are receiving benefits. And so that goes hand in hand with our national healthcare system. A national healthcare system won't work when we have tens of millions of people who are taking from it without giving to it. And that is a common, critique a lot of people on the right have, and I have, where, if I'm working 5 jobs, why should I have to pay for someone who's here illegally with no jobs to get the same treatment? And so, you can balance humanity, you can balance empathy, but you can also recognize that, yes, there needs to be a robust, all-encompassing plan that it tackles immigration, societal reform, societal, what's the word I'm looking for? Civic responsibility, civic liberty, and you can balance, like, these are all things that have to be balanced, and this requires a complete and total shift. And that's what the left was able to do with their wokeism, was capture not just institutions but the fabric of the civilization itself. And there needs to be a similar repertoire from the right if we're going to fix these issues, because we know that we have ideas and policies that won't just benefit us, that won't just benefit white people, that won't just benefit black people, that won't just benefit individual groups, but will benefit Americans overall, because we are all getting fucked in the ass by the system.
Mm-hmm.
And it
I
doesn't matter which color you elect, they're going to keep doing the same shit, because the same people are paying for their campaigns. The same donors have bought our congressmen, the same donors have bought our senators, and obviously not all of them, but a lot of them. And the same bureaucrats are in office. And so until that is fixed, nothing will improve.
it is one of these things that's just a fundamental matter of sovereignty, because there are a lot of right wingers who do actually, a surprising amount, who do actually support socialized healthcare, socialized medicine. Like, there are right wingers who do believe in those things. Perfect example, Donald Rumsfeld. When Donald Rumsfeld, prior to him getting
I
his
don't know if
job,
that's the best example to use, is Donald Rumsfeld.
yeah, but it's true though.
Continue, continue.
Donald Rumsfeld was always a striver. He was actually a very smart guy. I think he was a Wyoming state wrestling champion. Dude was always a smart guy. But when he was in the this was during the 80s, this was during the 70s, this was when he was in the Nixon administration. They actually had him oversee, because this was after the Great Society and all these different social programs were introduced by Johnson. He was actually overseeing many of these agencies that were responsible for, like, public health and social security and whatnot. And he was actually one of the few who actually supported these benefits, these kinds of, like, social benefits, these social programs, I think they're necessary. I think they're necessary. And there are right wingers who do it. It's one of those things that has to be destigmatized. For me, I've always been more of the Hamiltonian mindset. That's just my opinion. And I don't know why that is. I don't know. I'm not somebody who's like against big government. Like I think big government is actually good in many cases. I don't want a tyrannical government, a government that's crawling up my ass. But I think, huh?
So I'm opposed to a big government in one sense, and I think there's a difference in how it's described. So I do believe in a government that is capable of operating and capable of ensuring the liberties of its people and providing for the liberties of its people, but not a big government. And when it becomes overly bureaucratic, when it becomes a bureaucratic hellhole, when it becomes communism, when it becomes the state interfering with the lives of the citizenry, that's where it gets to a point where it's not that's big government. But having some form of government, I wouldn't even say oversight, but some form of baseline support is not inherently bad, but there does need to be balanced with the fact that yes, the governments are inherently corrupt by their nature, and any system implemented, even no matter how well intentioned, will eventually have to contest with bad actors.
Well, it's one of those things where it's like when I mean big government, you need a government that's strong and capable of statecraft. It has to be it can't be so highly restrained. And this is kind of one of the reasons why it's not unpopular now to talk about Trump running for a third term or the unitary executive theory. These things are becoming more normalized because I think what people see as the most viable path forward to solving many of the issues we have in this country is a big executive branch, big government that can overstep in many regards some of the limitations and the red tape that keep these people from actualizing the will of the people. That's one of the big problems here. And it doesn't have to be one of those things where it's necessarily, it doesn't have to be tyrannical. It just depends on how people define tyrannical. Some people think that it's tyrannical to do a federal requirement on everybody doing 1 or 2 years of civil service. Would you consider that tyrannical?
No, I would actually consider that beneficial to this country. To what Mexico used to do it, but some form of civil service. It not only does it build experience and builds resources, but it also creates an environment where people feel connected
Right.
to the state, where they feel like they have a stake in the society that they're
That's
a
right.
part of.
It's one of those things you want people to feel connected to the nation. You want them to feel or the state rather. It's one of those things where it's like it bonds people to the country that they live in a material way. And I think that there's something good to be said about that because people will say requiring everybody to do 1 year or 2 years of civil service, that's big government, that's tyrannical. And I'm like, well, you want people who are competent. You want a society that has a national identity. You want people to feel bonded. That's one of the easiest ways to do it. Get Americans from different backgrounds working in government to get to know each other. Like that seems like an obvious no brainer. Another one to me seems like doing this is going to sound crazy, but this is just my opinion. Federal school uniforms. Federal school uniforms, but the states get to decide the flag or the logo or whatever on those federal school uniforms. I think that would be cool. And I think that
I don't know if I go that far. I'd say maybe a dress code, but I don't know. I see that's where because that's then we're getting into areas of government control over education, and that's a whole separate argument. Because once you get into talking about even with something as mundane as uniforms, once you get into government control over regulation of education, that's where you start to get into the whole debate of state sovereignty versus federal sovereignty, and you get into the right to choose, because one of the core tenets of the right wing, and I at least conservatism, and it's something I still prescribe to, is school choice, and that being that there should be, and this is just like with healthcare, there should be options provided for public schooling. There should be, baseline public schools. And I do agree with you, there needs to be a change in philosophy and how the education system is, propagated, not just to build drones, but also not to just indoctrinate kids with a bunch of hoo-ha. And so I can see
patriotic education, that's what Trump
patriotic,
wanted.
patriotic education is important, but also it's still grounded in reality. You can't glaze American history too much, and in that case, it just becomes dogmatic,
It
and
does
that's
become brainwashing, indoctrination effectively.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
it's yeah.
true.
Brainwashing doesn't become suddenly good because our side's doing it.
Mhm.
Um, but so it sort of creates a environment there, but there still should be school choice. The government should help with charter schools. There should be a large option for charter schools. I will say, yes, there does need to be some form of. There is a okay. So we actually have another comment here, counterpointing you, and Bernie, you can respond to this. There are pros and cons for uniforms. Less bullying on what you wear, but less self-expression.
Yeah, well, I guess for me, I just feel like on some level you should feel a sense of obligation, a sense of duty, a sense of connection in a way that's tangible to your community, your school, your nation, something like that. I actually think that's good. It builds a national consciousness, which is why I like the idea of a federal school uniform. But people will say it's once again, people will say it's invasive, and I get that argument. I think that's totally a totally fair position. And so I don't really care that much about like the whole school self-expression thing. School serves one purpose. It isn't for you to go in there and express yourself. School serves a purpose of educating the population, giving them the skills necessary to succeed in society, teaching them how to socialize with other people who are of their age, and preparing them for the adult world. That's it. And to obviously oversee the well-being of children while their parents are at work. But for me, this whole, the whole self-expression thing at school, I don't really care that much. When you're outside of school, express yourself all you want. When you want to go get a steak or you want to go to the movies with your friends on a weekend, wear whatever the hell you want. But no, I don't think schools are obligated to allow students to express themselves. That's just my 2 cents. But people
Oh, I
are,
agree with that. I
yeah,
agree with that. It's just like how it is with employers, where yes, you have a right to self-expression, but you don't have a right to self-expression necessarily in school. And this isn't necessarily that radical of a change. Japan does it, Russia does it, a lot of African countries do it, Mexico even does it. Actually, in their education system, Mexico does have a standards. And Evelyn here had another comment saying, plus some families can't afford school regulated uniforms. So well, that would kind of just go inside where I think that the uniform should be free. The school
yeah.
uniform, if you're going to do a school uniform policy, it should not be incumbent on the families to pay for it. That should be incumbent on the school to pay for it. So that one's kind of a not that should be a non-issue, because in practice there's going to be a lot of poor school districts that can't, and so this is going to necessarily require government spending to implement the policy. So yes, there is going to be a pragmatic quagmire and even an ideological quagmire even among the right to justify the expense of it, the pro and con, cost some benefit. So I would say maybe instead of a school uniform, more of a sense of uh, I guess it makes students should dress sharp. I guess is a way to put it. Dress sharp. I do believe there should be school uniform should be a good option, but I think that there needs to be some. It should be up to the states. Is the way I see it. I think that it should be a resource provided by the federal government and should be up to the states to decide if they want to, or even up to some individual school districts if they want to adopt the uniform policy.
I agree. I'll say I agree. I just I just like the idea of that kind of national uniform sort of thing.
Well, I agree. I like it. Believe me, I like the idea. In fact, I really, really like the idea quite a lot. But
The
that's when you run
implications. It's one of the things you got to consider the logical implications of any position that you take. And I think that's actually right because otherwise it becomes dogmatic. Um yeah, the whole states' rights thing is also an interesting thing to me. Um I don't know. I'm not too familiar with states' rights. I've never really considered, the whole the states' rights argument all that much. Although I think,
for me, I'm a big
mm,
proponent of states' rights. I believe because inherently the U.S.'s foundational structure was it was a union of sovereign states, of independent states. Um, I like everyone's comment there. If there are uniforms, there should be options for girls to wear a skirt, shorts, or pants, and boys to wear shorts or pants. Yeah, I agree. That'd be a cool option.
that sounds good to me.
Bring back schoolgirl shirts, skirts. Hell
There
yeah,
you go. Yes,
hell
sir.
yeah, hell yeah. Anime artists rejoice. But when oh Jesus, the porn industry is gonna love that. But But yeah, what I was going on, what was I fucking saying? I
We're
lost
talking
my.
about states' rights. We were
That's
talking,
right. Thank
yeah.
you. Yes. So I do believe that inherently every state in the U.S. is an inherently sovereign, uh, anime but American. Jesus, yeah. So I do believe that every state is inherently sovereign, and they have the right to sovereignty, and that their sovereignty is invested and shared into the federal government, and that the predominant nature of the state and identity should still be within a loyalty to your state, and that there should be an overarching, loyalty in a sense of American nationalism, but also a state nationalism to a degree. And I think that the history, the culture, and the uniqueness of each state is intrinsic to America and is very unique to America. That each state does have its own history. They have their own founding fathers. They have their own reasons for being founded. You have the East Coast, New England. They were founded by settlers and created as religious groups fleeing persecution. They were created as farmers or industrialists. You have the Midwest, which were settled by agricultural people, Germans. You have the Southwest, which is a mix of Hispano and Anglo culture that created a very unique, and that was created predominantly by prospecting, mining, resource gathering. Then you have the West Coast, which was founded originally by prospecting, but it's also heavily based on industry. You have the Northwest, which is based on its logging, on its resources, on fishing. And you've got places like Florida that were Spanish colonies, and you have states that have just completely different histories. Some were British colonies, some were Spanish colonies, some were Canadian, some were Mexican, some were Native, and then you have like the Bible Belt, which has its own distinct history and culture and accent. And so there needs to be, as an extension of American nationalism, a sense of instilled sovereignty among states, because different states are going to have radically different opinions on things, and so they should still be allowed within reason to self-govern and for people to have a sense of nationalism for their state.
Hmm. That is actually an interesting take. Yeah. I think that's true. I think that's accurate. Um, do I disagree with that? No, not really. I think in principle that's probably the best path forward. I mean, you can't just do a complete overhaul or a complete, I don't know, subversion, I guess, of since time immemorial disagreement between the federal government, federalism and states' rights. What else is there that I would think would be good for to be federally administered? I'm trying to think. Hmm, what is another one? We touched on healthcare, we touched on education. No, yeah, I think
I appreciate it. Well, yeah, that's that. So I guess to summarize it back up, because I'm gonna have to get jumping off here in a minute, because I got a meeting with, well, actually with a GOP group, so I have
there
to
you
go.
go. Good man.
But I guess one thing we'll kind of sum back to is, I guess, the title of the show. Is there a future for Groypers? Do Groypers have a future? America First have a future on the right?
Oh, 100%. I think America First is the future. It might even be the present. Like I said, it is hard to know whether or not Twitter and the online world is like is an accurate heuristic for the real world, but it is important to keep in mind everybody. Let's just be real, Gen X, maybe not the baby boomers and the older generations, but everybody Gen X and under has a phone, they're on their phone, they're on social media, they're into politics. If you're into politics and you're right wing, you know who Nick Fuentes is. He's going to become a household name pretty soon here. And obviously, his clips are distributed on all the other major platforms: YouTube, X, Instagram, the whole nine yards. So, absolutely, they have a future in American politics. I think that is unquestionable, and I think they have a bright future. I think they're going to make a lot of positive changes.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That's the way it is, and the way I see it is, yes, I do believe America First is going to become the predominant ideology of the GOP. I think they're on track to the GOP. I think that as far as the Groypers specifically go with Nick's audience, I think it's going to be a ever force, and I think that's going to be an ever present check on the GOP. And I think that in a lot of ways, a lot of the stuff we discussed today will be used in arguments, but the argument will come down to, I think, on the right, who should get these benefits. It won't be necessarily, the argument's going to change from should we have healthcare, should we have school uniforms, should we have government assistance, and it's going to shift to who should be allowed to get it. And I think that's sort of where we're going to have the contention with the Wignats. We're going to have contention with the nationalists, and even Black nationalists, Hispanic nationalists, where nationalists, identitarians of all colors there's going to be a spirited debate on who has access to it. And
Mhm.
so that's going to be something that's going to have to be answered by, we're just talking heads. We're not going to be able to make an answer to this. It's going to be incumbent upon the individual politicians running within the movement and what they want to do. And so we're going to see the Groypers as a very predominant force of the right. They're going to become for us what the left wing activists are for the Democratic Party. They
100%.
very spirited, very gung ho, need to be appealed to, shock troop of the ideology, and that's just the way it is. That's the way it is now, and that's the way it's going to stay.
100%. I agree. I agree with you, Chuck.
I agree too. This was a good conversation. Nice 2.5 hour live
Definitely.
stream here. I'd be
Banger.
happy to go on longer. It just yeah, I kind of reached a hard stop, but
I feel
and
you.
also we started late because I overslept. So
Well, I appreciate you, man. Thank you.
hey, no worries. You ever want yeah, I'm always happy to reciprocate if you ever want to have me on. Man, I'll definitely try to have you on again. But you have a great night.
Heck yeah. You too, bro. Take care.
Hey, you too. Bye bye now.